A gray mist blanketed the rolling hills as Mason Reed pushed open the weathered barn door. The hinges screamed in protest, a chilling sound that cut through the dawn silence. Pale light crept through the gaps in the wooden slats, casting long fingers of gold across the dirt floor. Then Mason froze. 8 bodies hung from the rafters, suspended by crude ropes pulled tight around slender necks. Their shadows stretched long across the barn floor, dancing slightly as the morning breeze slipped through the cracks in the walls. 8 young women, their dark hair partially obscuring faces turned blue from strangulation, swayed gently like forgotten pendulums, counting time for no one. Mason's breath caught in his throat. His years on the battlefield had shown him hundreds of deaths, bodies torn apart by cannon firemen drowning in mud and their own blood. But nothing had prepared him for this. This wasn't a battlefield. This was his Uncle Samuel's farm, a place he had arrived at just hours ago, hoping to start anew. "Dear God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Then he heard it, a faint moan soft as a breeze from one of the hanging figures. The smallest one furthest from the door, a young girl no more than 16. Her eyes fluttered weakly. They weren't all dead. Mason didn't hesitate. 13 years of drifting, drowning his sorrows in whiskey, and chasing oblivion in gambling halls, none of that mattered now. His body remembered what to do before his mind could catch up. He pulled the hunting knife from his belt and rushed to the girl, wrapping one arm around her slight frame to take the weight off her neck as he slashed through the rope with his other hand. She collapsed against him, cold and limp, but still breathing. Mason lowered her gently to the ground, checking her pulse. Weak fluttering like a bird with a broken wing, but present. He struck her back firmly and a ragged cough escaped her lips. Without pausing, he moved to the others, slicing through each rope with grim efficiency. But as each body hit the ground with a dull thud, Mason's hope dimmed. The first girl had been the only survivor. 7 others, all young Apache women from their appearance, had been hanging too long. Mason returned to the living girl, scooping her into his arms. She was light terribly, so her skin cooled to the touch. Her neck bore angry red welts where the rope had bitten deep and dried blood had caked around the wounds. He carried her from the barn and across the overgrown yard to the cabin, his boots leaving tracks in the morning dew. The cabin itself was little better than the barn, a sagging roof, windows glazed with years of dust, the porch steps rotting. This was his inheritance from Uncle Samuel, this broken-down place with its hanged women and air of despair. Inside, Mason laid the girl on the only bed that wasn't covered in dust, his uncle's, he presumed. He worked quickly, drawing on battlefield medic skills he'd learned during the war. He cleaned the rope burns on her neck, applied salve from his saddlebag, and trickled water between her cracked lips. All the while, his mind raced with questions. Who had done this? Why, where was Uncle Samuel? As he wiped dirt from the girl's face with a damp cloth, Mason's hand froze. There on her right wrist, partially hidden by a frayed leather bracelet, was a scar in the distinct shape of a crescent moon. "It can't be," he whispered, pushing back the bracelet to examine the mark. The scar was old, well-healed, but unmistakable in its shape. Mason's fingers trembled as memories flooded back, a tiny silver bracelet with a crescent moon charm, small enough for a child's wrist. The bracelet he'd given his daughter Lucy on her 4th birthday, just months before the fever took her. Mason sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the cloth forgotten in his hand. The girl before him couldn't be Lucy. She was Apache older than Lucy would be alive when his daughter was long dead. Yet the coincidence of the mark struck him like a physical blow. Was this why Samuel's letter had been so cryptic? "Come to the farm, Mason. What's mine is now yours. Complete what I could not, my final responsibility to you." The girl stirred, her eyelids fluttering. Mason leaned forward, hope and dread mingling in his chest. Her eyes opened, fully dark, intelligent eyes that fixed on him with sudden terror. She scrambled backward on the bed, pressing herself against the headboard, her gaze darting wildly around the unfamiliar room. "Easy," Mason said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe now." The girl's hand went to her throat, feeling the bandages there. Her breathing came in quick, panicked gasps. Mason recalled the few Apache words he'd learned during his army days. "Dieu hashke da," he said haltingly. "No fear. Safe." The girl's eyes widened in surprise. She studied him for a long moment, then spoke in perfect, if slightly accented English. "Mr. Samuel taught me to speak properly. I don't need your broken Apache." It was Mason's turn to be surprised. "You know my uncle?" "Samuel Reed raised me since I was 6 years old." Her voice was raspy from the rope burn but clear. I am Morning Star. Where is my uncle? Mason asked, dread settling in his stomach like a stone. Morning Star's eyes filled with tears. They killed him 3 days ago. Got him when he tried to stop them from taking us. She swallowed painfully. He said you would come. He said to wait for Mason, the only one who could save us. The war never really ended for Mason Reed. 13 years had passed since Antietam, but the memories remained as sharp as bayonets. The creek running red with blood. The cornfield where so many men fell, they called it the Bloody Lane. His entire unit cut down around him in minutes, and the strange suspended moment when he knew he should be dead, but somehow wasn't. It was there lying among corpses with a minor wound in his side that Mason first met Samuel Reed. The older man, a Union Army surgeon, had been moving through the field of bodies checking for survivors. When he found Mason barely conscious, he'd knelt beside him. You're not done yet, son, Samuel had said, his hands already working to staunch the bleeding. You've got much more to do in this world. Mason remembered little of the field hospital. Only brief flashes of Samuel's face, grim but determined, working to save as many as he could. By the time Mason was well enough to thank him properly, Samuel had been reassigned. They exchanged a few letters in the war's aftermath, but as Mason's life collapsed around him, the correspondence had stopped. Returning home to Pennsylvania, Mason had found his beloved wife Catherine and 5-year-old daughter Lucy battling yellow fever. The same hands that had killed men in battle proved useless against the invisible enemy of disease. Within a week, both were gone, leaving Mason alone in a house filled with ghosts. He sold everything, unable to bear the emptiness, and began a life of wandering. 13 years of saloons and poker tables, taking odd jobs when money ran low, moving on when the nightmares found him again. Until Samuel's letter arrived, offering an inheritance and perhaps redemption. Now standing over his uncle's freshly dug grave beneath an ancient oak tree, Mason wondered if he'd arrived too late for both. He'd found Samuel's body in the back bedroom of the cabin, already beginning to decompose in the Arizona heat. A single bullet wound to the head told the story clearly enough. Mason had wrapped his uncle in a clean sheet and buried him with as much dignity as possible, fashioning a crude wooden cross to mark the spot. He kept saying you would come, Morning Star said softly, standing beside him at the grave. She had insisted on attending, despite her weakness. Even at the end, he believed in you. Mason stared at the cross, shame burning in his throat. I haven't given anyone reason to believe in me for a long time. Yet here you are. Morning Star placed a small bundle of desert flowers on the fresh earth, just as he said you would be. Too late to save him, but not too late for us. She turned to face him, her dark eyes intense despite her physical fragility. Not too late to fulfill his last wish. Mason frowned. What wish? Morning Star reached into the pocket of her simple dress, one of Samuel's shirts that Mason had helped modify for her, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He kept this in his medicine bag, said to give it to you when you arrived. Mason took the paper, unfolding it carefully. It was a formal-looking document, his uncle's will written in Samuel's precise handwriting and signed by 2 witnesses from the nearby town of Redemption Creek. The legal language was straightforward. Samuel Reed left his entire property, including the farm and all possessions, to his nephew Mason Reed. But it was the personal note scrawled at the bottom that made Mason's hands tremble. Mason, keep this land at all costs. Protect Morning Star. Complete what I could not, my final responsibility to you. They will return on the 3rd full moon to complete the blood ritual. Be ready, Samuel. What blood ritual? Mason asked, looking up sharply. Who's coming back? Morning Star's face was solemn. The men who did this, who killed Samuel and hanged my sisters. Sisters, those women in the barn were your family. Not by blood. Morning Star shook her head. We were all taken in by Samuel over the years. 7 tribes, 7 traditions. Samuel called us his rainbow of daughters. Her voice broke. I am the last. Mason looked toward the barn where the bodies still lay. He had covered them respectfully, but hadn't known what to do next. We need to bury them properly. Yes, Morning Star agreed, but first you should know what you have inherited, Mason Reed. This isn't just a farm, this is sacred ground, and in 3 days at the full moon they will return to claim it with our blood. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose as Mason dug the last grave. 7 in a row on the hilltop overlooking the valley, positioned as Morning Star had instructed, facing east to greet the rising sun on their journey to the spirit world. His hands were raw and blistered, his back aching from the hours of labor, but Mason welcomed the pain. It was honest pain earned through respect for the dead rather than self-destruction. For the first time in years, the whiskey bottle in his saddlebag had remained untouched through the night. Morningstar approached carrying bundles of sage cedar and tobacco. Despite her injuries, she had insisted on preparing the bodies herself, washing them, and dressing them in their finest clothes. Simple dresses adorned with beadwork and small totems that Samuel had kept safe for them. "They're ready," she said softly. Together they brought the 7 women from the barn, placing each gently in her grave. Mason had fashioned rough wooden markers for each carving, the names Morningstar provided. Swift River painted sky talking stone eagle, feather running brook, night blossom, and whispering wind. 7 tribes, 7 traditions. Morningstar explained placing specific tokens with each woman. Each was chosen saved by Samuel because they carried the old knowledge. Swift River was a storyteller keeper of our histories. Painted sky could heal with plants and prayers. Talking stone could speak to the ancestors through dreams. As she spoke of each woman, Morningstar's voice grew stronger, as if by remembering their gifts, she was keeping some essential part of them alive. When all was prepared, she began to sing. The melody was unlike anything Mason had ever heard, haunting and ancient, rising and falling, like the wind through canyon walls. Though he couldn't understand the Apache words, their meaning resonated in his chest, speaking of loss and continuance, endings and beginnings. Morningstar gestured for Mason to help. Following her instructions, he lit bundles of palm and cedar, letting the fragrant smoke drift over the graves. They placed offerings of tobacco, cornmeal, and small personal items with each woman. "This is how we honor those who have passed beyond," Morningstar explained. "The smoke carries our prayers to the spirit world. The offerings sustain them on their journey." As the burial ceremony continued, Mason found himself watching Morningstar more than the ritual itself. Despite her youth, she moved with the gravity of someone far older, someone who had seen too much. The rope burns on her neck stood out starkly against her brown skin, a cruel necklace of suffering. Yet there was a quiet dignity in her bearing that reminded him of Catherine, the same inner strength that had allowed his wife to smile even as the fever consumed her. And then there was the crescent moon scar on Morningstar's wrist, visible whenever her sleeve fell back. The same distinctive shape as the charm on Lucy's bracelet. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something, that Samuel had been trying to tell him something important. As the sun climbed higher, casting their shadows behind them, Morningstar completed the final prayers. The silence that followed felt charged with significance, as if the land itself were acknowledging their efforts. "Thank you," Morningstar said simply, looking at Mason with tired eyes. "Samuel would be pleased." Mason nodded suddenly, finding it difficult to speak. He hadn't attended Catherine and Lucy's funeral. He'd been too deep in the bottle by then, letting others handle the arrangements. This was the first time he'd properly said goodbye to anyone. Somehow it felt like he was saying goodbye to his own family as well. As they walked back down the hill toward the cabin, the morning breeze carrying the scent of sage behind them, Mason broke the silence. "You said these women were from 7 different tribes, but you're all Apache." "Apache is what white men call us," Morningstar explained. "We are many peoples: Mescalero, Jicarilla, Chiricahua, Lipan, Western Apache." Samuel understood this. He learned our true names, our true ways. "How did Samuel come to take in so many of you?" Morningstar's pace slowed. "That is a story best told by the fire when darkness has settled. Some words should not be spoken in daylight." Night fell over the farm, bringing with it a profound stillness, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant coyote. Mason built a fire in the small stone pit outside the cabin, the flames casting dancing shadows across the weathered porch. Morningstar sat wrapped in one of Samuel's old blankets, her eyes reflecting the golden light. This was the moment of quiet that Mason had been both craving and dreading, when the work of the day was done, when the bodies had been respectfully laid to rest, when there was nothing left but thought and memory. In years past, this was when he would reach for the bottle, desperate to blur the edges of consciousness. Tonight he resisted the urge. Something about Morningstar's watchful presence made him want to remain clear-headed, present in this moment of shared grief. "Will you tell me about them?" he asked softly. "About your sisters?" Morningstar nodded, her face solemn in the firelight. Swift River was the oldest. She remembered the time before when our people roamed freely. She knew stories going back 7 generations. A small smile touched her lips. She would make Samuel laugh with tales of Coyote the trickster, then make him weep with the story of our people's suffering. As she spoke of each woman, Morningstar's voice grew stronger, painting vivid pictures of these 7 remarkable souls. Painted Sky, who could find healing plants even in the desert winter. Eagle Feather, who had once been training as a warrior before soldiers destroyed her village. Night Blossom, who could read the stars like a map. And you, Mason asked when she fell silent, what is your gift? Morningstar looked into the fire. I remember. That is my gift. When others forget, I remember. Remember what? Everything, the old ways, the massacres, the faces of those who hurt us, the kindness of those who saved us. Her dark eyes lifted to meet his. I remember your face, Mason Reed. Mason startled. We've never met before yesterday. Not in body, perhaps, but Samuel spoke of you often. Showed me the one photograph he had you in your Union uniform before the great battle. She studied him. You look older now, sadder. Mason stared into the fire, uncomfortable under her perceptive gaze. A lot has happened since that picture was taken. Samuel told me about your wife and daughter, Morningstar said gently, about Catherine and little Lucy. Hearing their names spoken aloud sent a jolt through Mason's chest. Few people in his drifting years had known about his family. He'd preferred it that way, keeping his grief private. What else did he tell you? Mason asked, his voice rough. That you were a good man once. That the war and the fever took something from you that he hoped you would find again. Morningstar's gaze was steady. He believed this land could heal you as it healed him. Mason gave a bitter laugh. Some healing, he's dead, and 7 innocent women with him. The land didn't kill them. Men did. Morningstar's voice hardened. Men who fear what they cannot control. They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Mason spoke, the words coming slowly, painfully, like pulling splinters from deep wounds. Lucy was 5 when the fever came. Just a little thing with Catherine's eye, then my stubborn chin. He swallowed hard. I had given her a silver bracelet for her birthday, a tiny thing with a crescent moon charm. She loved it so much she wouldn't take it off even to bathe. Morningstar's hand moved unconsciously to her own wrist, to the crescent scar there. I was away when they first fell ill. Mason continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. Taking a load of grain to market. By the time I returned, Catherine could barely stand, and Lucy was burning with fever. The memories came flooding back, Catherine's flushed face, Lucy's tiny hand clutching his shirt, the doctor's grim expression, the helplessness that had overwhelmed him. I couldn't save them. All those men I'd killed in battle, and I couldn't save the only 2 people who mattered. Mason's voice broke. After they were gone, I couldn't bear to stay. I sold everything, started drinking. Became someone else, someone Catherine would have been ashamed of. Morningstar listened without judgment, her young face solemn in the firelight. When Mason fell silent, she spoke softly. My earliest memory is of smoke and screaming. I was 6 years old when soldiers came to our village. They killed the men first, then the older women. The young women they took for other purposes. Her voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly. I hid under a fallen wickiup covered in dirt and ash. I watched through a crack as they shot my mother when she fought back against a soldier. Mason closed his eyes, knowing all too well what soldiers could do in the name of pacification. I lay there for 2 days, afraid to move, drinking rainwater that pooled near my face. Morningstar continued. Then a different white man came, one in a doctor's coat. He was looking for survivors, calling out that he meant no harm. That was Samuel. He saved you, Mason said softly. Morningstar nodded. He saved all of us at different times from different massacres. Brought us here, taught us to read, to speak English, to move between both worlds. He said someday we would need these skills to survive. Mason thought of the cryptic note in Samuel's will. Complete what I could not, my final responsibility to you. What had his uncle been trying to accomplish here? You should rest, he said, noticing how Morningstar's eyelids were drooping despite her effort to stay alert. Tomorrow we'll need to prepare for whatever's coming. Morningstar nodded and rose but paused before entering the cabin. When the nightmares come tonight, remember that you are not alone in them. We all carry ghosts, Mason Reed. After she had gone inside, Mason remained by the fire watching the flames slowly die to embers. When he finally stretched out on his bedroll on the porch, sleep came more easily than it had in years. But Morningstar was right about the nightmares. In his dreams, Mason was back at Antietam, surrounded by fallen comrades. But as he moved among the bodies, they transformed, no longer fellow soldiers, but 7 Apache women, their necks bruised by ropes. And standing among them a small girl with Catherine's eyes and his stubborn chin, a silver bracelet glinting on her wrist. Lucy reached for him, her lips forming words he couldn't hear. Mason stretched out his hand, desperate to touch her one more time, but the distance between them grew impossibly wide. He woke with a start, sweat-soaked despite the cool night air. From inside the cabin came a soft singing, Morningstar's voice, gentle but clear, singing what sounded like a lullaby in her native tongue. Mason lay back, letting the unfamiliar melody wash over him. Gradually, his breathing slowed and the grip of the nightmare loosened. He didn't return to sleep, but for the first time in years, the wakeful hours weren't filled with dread. As dawn approached, Mason made a decision. Whatever Samuel had been protecting here, whatever was coming in 3 days, he would face it head on. No more running, no more drowning his ghosts in whiskey. He owed Samuel that much, and perhaps he owed it to himself as well. The morning brought clarity and purpose. After a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and coffee, Mason set about exploring the cabin more thoroughly. If he was going to defend this place, he needed to know its secrets. The cabin itself was sturdier than it first appeared, built of thick pine logs with a stone foundation. 2 main rooms downstairs, a kitchen living area, and Samuel's bedroom with a small loft above accessible by a ladder. Simple but solid furnishings, well crafted and cared for despite the layer of dust that had settled in the weeks since Samuel's death. What struck Mason most was the number of books. Shelves lined every available wall, filled with medical texts, history volumes, botanical studies, and surprisingly numerous works in various native languages. Samuel had been a learned man, far more so than Mason had realized from their brief wartime acquaintance. He taught us from these, Morningstar said, running her fingers along the spines. Said knowledge was the one thing white men couldn't take from us if we hid it well enough. She tapped her temple. In here. As Mason continued his inventory, he noticed something odd about the bedroom wall, a section where the measurements didn't quite add up, leaving several feet unaccounted for. Is there a hidden space here? He asked, knocking on the pine panels. Morningstar's expression revealed nothing. Samuel had many secrets. Mason examined the wall more closely, finally discovering a nearly invisible seam. Pressing firmly on one panel caused another to pop slightly outward. He pulled, and a section of the wall swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow hidden room. Inside was a small desk, a chair, and several locked strongboxes. Maps covered one wall, detailed surveys of the surrounding territory, with notations in Samuel's precise handwriting. The opposite wall held something that made Mason inhale sharply, a Confederate Army uniform with captain's insignia. Samuel was Union, Mason said, confused. It wasn't his, Morningstar explained from the doorway. He kept it as evidence. Evidence of what? Of who really gave the orders to massacre my people. Mason turned to the desk where a leather-bound journal lay open. Samuel's journal filled with entries spanning more than a decade. Mason sat down and began to read, Morningstar watching silently from the doorway. The journal told a story far different from what Mason had imagined. Samuel had indeed been a Union Army surgeon, but after Antietam, he'd been reassigned to the Western Territories. There he'd witnessed atrocities against Native peoples that had shaken his faith in the military and the government it served. One name appeared repeatedly in the later entries, Colonel Theodore Harmon, commander of a volunteer cavalry regiment tasked with pacifying Apache resistance. According to Samuel's detailed accounts, Harmon had orchestrated some of the worst massacres, often against peaceful bands who had already agreed to treaty terms. Harmon now calls himself Mayor Harmon, Morningstar said quietly. He runs Redemption Creek. Mason continued reading, his stomach tightening as he reached entries from the past few years. Samuel had discovered that the farm which he had purchased cheaply as worthless scrubland sat atop both a rich silver deposit and an ancient Apache burial ground. The Fallen Star Mine, Samuel had written, they call it a lucky strike, but it would mean desecrating sacred ground. Some treasures should remain buried. More recent entries revealed that Harmon had somehow learned of the silver and was determined to acquire the land. He had first tried to buy it legally, then through intimidation. When Samuel refused all offers, threats began. The final entry, dated just 4 days earlier, chilled Mason's blood. "They're coming tomorrow. My sources in town confirm it. Harmon means to kill me and blame it on Apache raiders. Then the land will go to auction, and his mining company will acquire it legally. I've sent for Mason, pray he arrives in time. The girls must be protected at all costs. They are the last of their knowledge lines, the last who remember the old ways. If they die, centuries of wisdom die with them. And Morning Star, she above all must survive. For Mason's sake, if nothing else." Mason looked up from the journal, questions burning in his mind. What did he mean, for Mason's sake? Before Morning Star could answer, a sound from outside caught their attention, hoofbeats approaching, multiple riders. Mason moved quickly to the window, peering through the dusty glass. 3 men on horseback were crossing the yard, heading for the cabin. The one in front rode a magnificent black stallion and wore an expensive black coat despite the Arizona heat. His silver hair and beard were immaculately groomed, his bearing military despite his civilian clothes. "Harmon," Morning Star whispered, her face suddenly ashen. "He's come early." Mason grabbed his rifle from beside the door. "Stay inside. Stay out of sight." He stepped onto the porch just as the riders reached the hitching post. The silver-haired man, Harmon, surveyed Mason with cold blue eyes that missed nothing. "You must be the nephew," Harmon said, his voice cultured, controlled. "Mayor Theodore Harmon of Redemption Creek. I've come to pay my respects. Your uncle was a valued member of our community." Mason nodded stiffly, keeping his rifle visible but not raised. "Mason Reed just arrived yesterday." Harmon dismounted with the fluid grace of a much younger man. His companions remained on horseback, hands casually near their holstered pistols. "A terrible tragedy," Harmon said, shaking his head sadly. "Apache raiders, we believe. They've been growing bolder lately." His gaze sharpened. "I understand you found bodies in the barn." 7 women, Mason confirmed, watching Harmon's face carefully. "Hanged." "Savages," Harmon spat. "This is what we deal with out here, Mr. Reed. The Apache have no respect for human life, especially a white man who dared live alone on the frontier." Mason said nothing, remembering Samuel's journal entries. This man had orchestrated massacres and now stood on Samuel's porch speaking of savagery. "I understand you're now the owner of this property," Harmon continued smoothly. "I wanted to extend an offer. My company would be willing to purchase this land for a very generous sum, enough for you to buy a proper ranch elsewhere, somewhere safer." "I only just arrived," Mason said. "Haven't had time to consider my options." Harmon's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, but I should warn you, this is unlucky ground. The Apache believe it's haunted by spirits. And after what happened to your uncle," he let the implication hang in the air, "my offer won't remain open indefinitely. The town is expanding and we need this land." One of Harmon's men shifted in his saddle, drawing Mason's attention. The movement revealed a distinctive scar along the man's jawline, a knife wound poorly healed. Something about it triggered Mason's memory. He'd seen that scar before in the war. "Think about it, Mr. Reed," Harmon said, turning back to his horse. "Redemption Creek could use a man with military experience. There might be a position available in the town marshal's office if farming doesn't suit you." As they rode away, Mason remained on the porch, his mind racing. Harmon clearly wanted the land for the silver mine, but there was something else, something in the way he'd asked about the bodies, as if confirming they'd been found. When he was certain they were gone, Mason returned inside to find Morning Star emerging from the hidden room, her face tight with fear. "You've seen him now," she said, "the monster who wears a mayor's smile." "He knew about the bodies," Mason said. "Wanted to make sure I'd found them." Morning Star nodded grimly. "Because he put them there. He and his men came 4 days ago. Samuel tried to stop them from taking us, so they shot him. Then they took us to the barn." Her hand went unconsciously to her throat. "They hanged my sisters one by one, making each watch the others die. They said it was justice for raids we never committed. But they left you alive." "Not intentionally. The rope broke when they hanged me last. I fell, hit my head. They thought I was dead and left." Her eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't save them. I could only lie there listening to them struggle for breath." Mason's jaw tightened with anger. "Why didn't they just shoot you all?" Why the hanging? To send a message, to make it look like punishment for Samuel's death. Morningstar's voice hardened. They planned to blame Apache raiders for killing Samuel, then claim vigilantes from town had caught and hanged the killers. It was a coldly calculated plan: eliminate Samuel, eliminate witnesses, acquire the land legally at auction, and further inflame anti-Apache sentiment in the territory, all to access a silver mine on sacred ground. "They'll be back," Morningstar said, "when they discover I'm alive, when they realize you know the truth." Mason nodded grimly. Samuel's note said they'd return on the third full moon, something about completing a blood ritual. Morningstar's expression grew solemn. "The full moon rises in 3 days. It marks the spirit path night in our tradition, when the barrier between worlds is thinnest. They plan to kill me on sacred ground as the moon rises, completing the desecration." Her dark eyes met his. "7 died already. I am the 8th, the one who carries all the knowledge of the others. If I die on that night on that ground, our ancestors will abandon this place forever. And then Harmon can mine the silver without consequences," Mason finished, "without fear of disturbing sacred ground." Yes, Morningstar looked toward the hidden room. Samuel knew this. He was preparing to stop them. "Now that task falls to you." She paused. "But first, there's something else you need to see." She led Mason back into the hidden room to a floorboard that looked no different from the others. Pressing in a certain way caused it to pop up, revealing another deeper hiding place. From it, Morningstar withdrew a small metal box. "Samuel said to show you this if he died. Said you would understand then." Mason took the box, a sense of foreboding settling over him. Inside was a stack of photographs, the new kind clearer than the old daguerreotypes. They showed Colonel Harmon in uniform, overseeing what could only be described as massacres. Apache villages burning bodies strewn about soldiers, posed with trophies taken from the dead. Beneath the photographs was a letter sealed and addressed to the territorial governor, detailing Harmon's crimes with dates, locations, and witnesses. It was signed by Samuel, but had never been sent. And at the very bottom of the box, something that made Mason's blood run cold, a tiny silver bracelet with a crescent moon charm tarnished with age and what looked like dried blood. Lucy's bracelet, the one she had refused to take off even as the fever consumed her. "What is this?" Mason asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How did Samuel have this?" Morningstar touched the scar on her wrist. "That is the beginning of the story. The part Samuel said must wait until you are ready to hear it." Mason stared at the tiny bracelet in his palm, memories flooding back with painful clarity. Lucy's delighted smile when he'd given it to her, Catherine fastening it around their daughter's small wrist. The way Lucy had twirled, making the crescent moon catch the light. "This belonged to my daughter," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She was wearing it when she died." Morningstar sat beside him in the hidden room, her face solemn. "Samuel said it was important, that it connected us somehow. How my family died in Pennsylvania, thousands of miles from here. Not all stories move in straight lines," Mason read. Morningstar took the bracelet gently from his hand. "Sometimes they circle back on themselves like the paths of the stars." She turned the small silver crescent over, revealing an inscription on the back that Mason had forgotten, tiny letters spelling out, "To Lucy, our brightest star." "Samuel found me wearing this," Morningstar explained. "After the soldiers attacked my village, after he saved me, he noticed it tangled in my hair. He said it was a sign." Mason's mind reeled. "But that's impossible. Lucy died of yellow fever. Catherine and I buried her." "Did you?" Morningstar asked quietly. "Were you there?" The question hit Mason like a physical blow. He hadn't been there. Consumed by grief and whiskey, he'd left all arrangements to the town pastor and Catherine's brother. He'd been too broken to attend the funeral, too cowardly to look upon the small coffin. "Samuel never told me the full story," Morningstar continued. "Said it wasn't his place, that when the time was right, you would come and all would be revealed." She looked down at the bracelet. "But he said this connected us. Said it was why he gave me the name Morning Star in your language, though my Apache name is different." Mason stood abruptly, pacing the small hidden room. It was too much to process: the silver mine, Harmon's massacres, Samuel's death, and now this impossible connection to his long-dead daughter. His eyes fell on the maps covering one wall, detailed surveys of the surrounding land. One in particular caught his attention, a topographical map with red markings indicating the silver deposit beneath the farm. But there was something else, faint lines in blue ink showing what appeared to be underground passages. "What are these?" he asked, pointing to the blue lines. Morningstar joined him, studying the map. "The sacred caves, they run beneath the farm and extend to the valley beyond. The entrances were hidden by my ancestors long ago. These connect to the silver deposit. They are the silver deposit or part of it. To my people, the metal was sacred, used only for ceremonial purposes. The caves themselves are burial chambers for our greatest leaders." Mason traced the blue lines with his finger, noting where they intersected with the main house, the barn, and extended toward a formation marked Spirit Mesa, several miles to the east. "Samuel knew about these caves." Morningstar nodded. "He discovered one entrance accidentally when digging a new well. Once he understood what he'd found, he sealed it again out of respect. But he mapped the system using old tribal knowledge I shared with him." Mason's tactical mind, honed by war, immediately saw the strategic value of these hidden passages. If Harmon and his men returned in force, the caves could provide both escape routes and defensive positions. "Can you show me one of the entrances?" Morningstar hesitated. "They are sacred places. No outsider has entered them in generations." "I'm not asking out of curiosity," Mason said. "If Harmon comes back with more men, we may need every advantage." After a moment's consideration, Morningstar nodded. "There is an entrance in the root cellar. I will show you, but we must go with respect." As they prepared to leave the hidden room, Mason tucked Lucy's bracelet carefully into his shirt pocket, alongside the photograph of Catherine he'd carried through the war and his years of wandering. Questions still swirled in his mind. How had Lucy's bracelet ended up with a young Apache girl thousands of miles from Pennsylvania? What had Samuel known that he hadn't shared? But those questions would have to wait. Right now, they needed to prepare for Harmon's return. 3 days until the full moon. 3 days to ready themselves for whatever came next. As Morningstar led him toward the root cellar at the back of the cabin, Mason felt a strange sensation. Not the familiar weight of dread that had been his constant companion for 13 years, but something lighter, something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. The entrance to the sacred caves was masterfully concealed, a section of the root cellar's stone foundation that pivoted smoothly when pressure was applied in just the right spot. Morningstar demonstrated the mechanism with practiced ease, revealing a narrow passage that descended steeply into darkness. "Samuel reinforced the upper section with timber," she explained, lighting a small oil lamp. "The natural cave begins 20 feet down." Mason followed her into the passage, ducking his head beneath the low ceiling. The air grew cooler as they descended, carrying a faint mineral scent. When the rough-hewn steps gave way to smooth stone, Morningstar paused. "From here we walk on sacred ground," she said solemnly. "Please show respect." The passage widened into a large chamber with walls that glittered faintly in the lamplight, veins of silver running through the rock like frozen lightning. Along one wall, niches had been carved, each containing bundles wrapped in deteriorating hide and cloth. "The ancestors," Morningstar whispered, making a respectful gesture toward the remains. "Great leaders from 7 generations." Mason removed his hat, feeling like an intruder in a church. The chamber had a hushed quality that demanded reverence, a sense of accumulated time and memory that made his own life seem momentary by comparison. Morningstar moved confidently through the chamber toward another passage. "This way leads to other entrances. One emerges near the oak where Samuel is buried. Another opens at Spirit Mesa, where the tribal council once gathered." Mason studied the layout, committing it to memory. These passages could indeed provide tactical advantages, but using them would mean potentially desecrating sacred ground. He would need to tread carefully, balancing practical necessities with respect for Morningstar's traditions. They had just started back toward the cellar entrance when a sound from above froze them both, the cabin door banging open, followed by heavy footsteps crossing the floor. Mason extinguished the lamp, immediately plunging them into darkness. He drew his revolver, positioning himself protectively in front of Morningstar. "Stay here," he whispered. "I'll check." "No." Her hand found his arm unerringly in the darkness. "Together." They crept up the steps, Morningstar guiding him silently through the pitch black. At the top, Mason paused, listening intently. The footsteps had stopped, but he could hear someone breathing heavily, as if from exertion or pain. With practiced stealth, Mason eased the hidden door open just enough to peer through. A sliver of daylight revealed a man slumped at Samuel's kitchen table, not Harmon, but someone younger bleeding from a wound in his shoulder. The stranger's head was bowed, his hat pulled low, but Mason could see he wore a deputy's badge. Mason opened the door fully, his gun trained on the intruder. "Don't move." The man's head jerked up, revealing a gaunt face with several days' worth of beard. His eyes were feverish, his skin pale beneath the tan. "Reed," the man gasped. "Mason Reed, who's asking? Jacob Wright, deputy in Redemption Creek." He grimaced in pain. "Or I was until this morning." Mason kept his gun steady. "What are you doing here?" "Warning you." Wright's eyes shifted to Morningstar, who had emerged behind Mason. "Both of you. Harmon knows she survived. He's gathering men. They'll be here by nightfall." Morningstar stiffened. "How do we know this isn't a trap?" "Because of this." Wright gestured weakly to his bleeding shoulder. "Harmon's gift, when I refused to join his hunting party, said I'd gone soft on Indians." He coughed, bringing up flecks of blood. "Maybe I have. Seen too much killing." Mason holstered his revolver and approached cautiously, his medical training taking over. The wound was a clean through and through, the bullet having passed through the fleshy part of Wright's shoulder without hitting bone. "Morningstar, get my saddlebag," Mason directed. "Has medical supplies." As she hurried to comply, Mason helped Wright out of his bloody jacket. "Why the change of heart, deputy? Why warn us?" Wright's laugh was bitter. "Been asking myself the same question for 20 miles. He winced as Mason probed the wound. "I was a preacher once before the war. Came west to start fresh, ended up wearing a badge in a town run by a killer." Morningstar returned with the medical supplies, her expression guarded. "He was there," she said to Mason. "When they took us from the cabin, when they shot Samuel." Wright couldn't meet her eyes. "Yes, I was there. Didn't fire a shot, but I didn't stop it either." His voice dropped. "I've been not stopping things for too long." Mason cleaned the wound with whiskey, causing Wright to hiss in pain. "Harmon said the attack would come at the full moon. Why the change in plans?" "Fear." Wright gritted his teeth as Mason began stitching. "After you didn't sell to him this morning, he got spooked. Said you looked too much like someone who might cause trouble. Then one of his scouts reported the Apache girl was alive." He glanced at Morningstar. "He can't risk you telling your story or Reed here finding Samuel's evidence." Morningstar's eyes widened. "How does he know about the evidence?" "Samuel threatened him with it, tried to use it as leverage to protect you girls." Wright shook his head. Biggest mistake he could have made. Showed his hand too soon. Mason finished the stitches and applied a clean bandage. "How many men is Harmon bringing?" 15, maybe 20. His private army paid from mining profits." Wright accepted a cup of water from Morningstar with a nod of thanks. "They'll come heavily armed, probably at dusk. Harmon likes to do his dirty work in the shadows." Mason's mind raced, calculating odds and options. 20 armed men against himself, an injured deputy, and a young woman. The cabin itself offered little protection, wood walls that bullets would pierce easily. "The caves," Morningstar said, reading his thoughts. "We can use them." Wright looked confused. "Caves." "There's a network beneath the farm," Mason explained, making a quick decision to trust the deputy. "If we can lure Harmon's men into the right position." He moved to the map on the kitchen wall, a simple farmer's sketch of the property that would reveal nothing to casual observers. Using a piece of charcoal, Mason began marking positions, his military training resurfacing. "We need to split them up, use the terrain to our advantage," he muttered half to himself. "Harmon will expect us to either flee or barricade ourselves in the cabin." "There's something else you should know," Wright said, his voice grave. "Harmon's obsessed with this land. It's not just about the silver." "What do you mean?" "He lost his family to an Apache raid 15 years ago, wife and 2 sons. Wright's eyes were troubled. "Ever since he's been on a mission to eradicate anything Apache from the territory. This land, he calls it his final victory. Says once he cleanses it, his family can rest." The information added a new dimension to their predicament. Harmon wasn't just a greedy man after silver, he was a crusader driven by grief and hatred. Such men were far more dangerous than those motivated merely by profit. "We need more time to prepare," Mason said, studying the map. "And we're outnumbered." Morningstar had been silent, watching their exchange with thoughtful eyes. Now she spoke, her voice calm but resolute. There is another option. My people, the survivors of Harmon's massacres. Wright shook his head. The nearest Apache settlement is 50 miles north in the mountains. Not all of my people live in settlements the white government knows about, Morningstar replied. What remain hidden guarding the old ways? She turned to Mason. There is a camp a day's ride from here in Black Canyon. Samuel helped them many times. They would help us, but only you can go. They would kill the deputy on sight. Mason considered their options. If Harmon was truly coming with 20 men by nightfall, their chances were slim. But if he could reach Morningstar's people, bring back warriors. Can you and Wright hold the farm until tomorrow? He asked Morningstar. She nodded. The caves have many entrances. We can evade them if necessary, lead them in circles. I can still shoot, Wright added, adjusting his wounded arm. And I know Harmon's tactics. He'll set up a perimeter, wait for us to make a mistake. Mason made his decision. I'll leave within the hour. Morningstar, I'll need directions to the camp. As Morningstar began drawing a rough map, Mason felt a strange sense of purpose filling him, something he hadn't experienced since the war. For 13 years, he'd been running from his past, from his pain. Now he was running towards something, the chance to protect an innocent, to honor Samuel's memory, perhaps even to redeem himself in some small way. And beneath it all, the mystery of Lucy's bracelet and its connection to Morningstar tugged at him. Something told him the answers lay ahead if he could just live long enough to find them. Mason rode hard across the parched landscape, pushing his horse as fast as he dared in the growing heat of the day. The directions Morningstar had given him were etched in his mind. Follow the dry creek bed south until it splits at the lightning-struck cottonwood, then east through the narrow pass between twin mesas, finally north into Black Canyon, where no white man was welcome. The sun climbed mercilessly overhead, baking the red earth and sending heat waves shimmering across the distant horizon. Mason pulled his hat lower, squinting against the glare. His canteen was already half empty, and miles of hard riding lay ahead. His thoughts returned to the farm, to Morningstar, and the wounded deputy he'd left behind. Had he made the right decision, leaving them to face Harmon's men? Wright's wound would limit his effectiveness in a fight, and Morningstar, for all her courage, was just one young woman against a small army of killers. But there had been no better option. If Harmon truly arrived with 20 armed men, their only hope lay with reinforcements from Morningstar's people, and Mason was the only one who could make that journey. By midday, he reached the lightning-struck cottonwood, a massive ancient tree, split down the middle by some long-ago storm, yet still clinging to life on one side. Its surviving branches were adorned with small bundles of cloth and feathers, marking it as a place of significance to the Apache. Mason paused in its meager shade, allowing his horse to rest briefly while he consulted Morningstar's map. The girl had a surprising talent for cartography, her simple drawing capturing essential landmarks with remarkable accuracy. The twin mesas should lie just beyond the next ridge. As he prepared to mount up again, a flicker of movement caught his eye, a dust trail perhaps 2 miles behind him. Riders moving fast. Harmon's men. Had they somehow anticipated his plan? Mason didn't wait to find out. He urged his horse forward, abandoning the relatively easy path along the creek bed for rougher terrain that would provide more cover. If he was being followed, he couldn't lead them directly to the Apache camp. Too many lives depended on his success. The twin mesas rose before him an hour later, massive flat-topped formations standing like sentinels guarding the narrow pass between them. Morningstar had warned him this was the most dangerous part of the journey. The pass created a natural bottleneck where ambushes were common both from hostile tribes and from white bandits who preyed on travelers. Mason approached cautiously, scanning the steep walls of the pass for any sign of movement. Nothing stirred except a lone hawk circling overhead. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck prickled with the sensation of being watched. Halfway through the pass, his instincts proved correct. A small shower of pebbles cascaded down the cliff face to his right, a subtle warning that could have been mistaken for natural erosion by a less experienced man. Mason reined his horse to a stop, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. "I come seeking the people of Morningstar," he called out in English, then repeated the same phrase in the broken Apache that Morningstar had taught him. "I bring urgent news from Samuel Reed's farm." Silence answered him, but Mason could feel the weight of the unseen eyes. He remained still patient, knowing that any sudden movement might be met with arrows. Finally, a voice called down from above, a man speaking accented but clear English. Samuel Reed is known to us. Who are you to speak his name? Mason Reed, his nephew. I've come from his farm where Morning Star now waits. She sent me to seek help. More silence. Then what proof do you bring that Morning Star lives? We heard all of Samuel's daughters were killed. Mason reached slowly into his pocket and withdrew Lucy's silver bracelet, the token Morning Star had insisted he bring. She gave me this, said it would identify me as a friend. A figure appeared at the edge of the cliff above a young Apache warrior with a drawn bow. He studied Mason and the bracelet for a long moment, then nodded once. Continue through the paso, you will be met. Mason urged his horse forward, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. The first hurdle was crossed, but convincing the Apache to risk their lives for a white man's farm would be far more difficult. Beyond the pass, the landscape changed dramatically. The parched flatlands gave way to rising terrain cut through with deep arroyos and dotted with juniper and pinon pine. The air grew slightly cooler as the elevation increased, carrying the scent of resin and wild sage. As promised, Mason was met at the mouth of Black Canyon by 4 mounted warriors, their faces painted for war, their expressions impassive. Without a word, they surrounded him and led him deeper into the canyon, where the walls rose ever higher, blocking the harsh sunlight and creating a world of shadow and echoes. The Apache camp was hidden in a side canyon, invisible until they were nearly upon it. Unlike the traditional villages Mason had seen during his army days, this settlement showed few signs of permanence. Brush shelters that could be dismantled quickly, minimal fires, nothing that would attract attention from above. As they rode into the camp, women gathered children close, and old men watched with wary eyes. Mason felt the weight of their collective gaze, distrust born from generations of betrayal. The warriors led him to the largest shelter at the center of the camp. There, seated on a simple blanket, was a man whose dignity needed no adornment. His face was deeply lined, his hair gray, but his eyes were sharp and clear. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw on the left side of his face, an old wound that had healed poorly. "This is Chief Lone Wolf," one of the warriors said. "He will hear your words." Mason dismounted and approached respectfully, stopping at a distance that would not be seen as threatening. "Thank you for receiving me," he said, bowing his head slightly. Lone Wolf studied him in silence for a long moment. "I knew Samuel Reed," he finally said, his voice deep and measured. "He was a man who kept his word, even when it cost him." "Are you such a man, Mason Reed?" "I try to be," Mason answered honestly, "though I've failed more often than I care to remember." A flicker of something, perhaps approval, crossed Lone Wolf's face. "Honesty is a beginning. Tell me why Morning Star has sent you." Mason explained the situation concisely. Samuel's murder, the hanging of the 7 women, Morning Star's survival, and Harmon's impotent attack on the farm. As he spoke, he saw anger tighten the faces of the warriors gathered around, but Lone Wolf's expression remained controlled. "These 7 who died, you know who they were?" Lone Wolf asked when Mason finished. Morning Star called them her sisters, said they represented 7 tribes, 7 traditions. Lone Wolf nodded gravely. They were knowledge keepers. Each carried the songs, stories, and medicine ways of their people. Their deaths are not just the loss of 7 lives, but the loss of centuries of wisdom. His eyes hardened. And Morning Star is the one who connects them all. "She said Harmon plans to kill her on sacred ground during the full moon," Mason added. "Something about a blood ritual to cleanse the land." A murmur ran through the gathered warriors. Lone Wolf silenced them with a raised hand. "This man Harmon knows enough of our ways to be dangerous. The full moon is the spirit path night when our ancestors walk between worlds. Blood spilled on sacred ground during this time can either honor or desecrate, depending on the intent." "Harmon's intent is clear," Mason said grimly. "He wants the silver beneath the farm. Killing Morning Star on sacred ground is his way of driving your ancestors' spirits from the land so he can mine without consequence." Lone Wolf was silent for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "Why do you care, Mason Reed? This is not your fight. You could sell the land, take the money, return to the white man's world." The question struck Mason like a physical blow. Why did he care? A week ago, he'd been drifting aimlessly, caring about nothing but his next drink. Now he was risking his life for a farm he barely knew and a girl who was a stranger to him. Except she wasn't. Something about Morning Star had awakened something in him, something he'd thought long dead. My uncle gave his life trying to protect these women, Mason said slowly. He believed their knowledge was worth preserving. In Morning Star, he hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew Lucy's bracelet. There's a connection I don't fully understand yet, but I know it matters. Lone Wolf's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the bracelet. He held out his hand and Mason placed a small silver crescent in his palm. Where did you get this? Lone Wolf asked, his voice suddenly tense. It belonged to my daughter Lucy. She died of fever 13 years ago. Mason watched as the chief turned the bracelet over, examining the inscription. Somehow Morningstar had it when Samuel found her. Lone Wolf closed his fingers around the bracelet, his expression unreadable. There is much you do not know, Mason Reed. Much Samuel kept from you. He returned the bracelet. But now is not the time for those stories. Now is the time for war. He rose to his feet, suddenly seeming taller, more commanding. Harmon has been a disease upon our people for too long. 7 knowledge keepers dead, dozens of villages destroyed, hundreds of lives taken. His voice carried through the camp. The time has come to cut out this disease. The gathered warriors nodded in agreement, their hands moving to weapons. But Mason felt a sense of unease. My uncle was a man of peace, he said carefully. He would not want more bloodshed. Sometimes blood is the only language men like Harmon understand, Lone Wolf replied. But fear not, we will not slaughter indiscriminately as white men do. Our quarrel is with Harmon and those who follow him willingly. No one else. He turned to the warriors. Prepare yourselves. We ride at sunset. As the camp erupted into activity, Lone Wolf gestured for Mason to follow him into his shelter. Inside, away from the eyes of others, the chief's stern demeanor softened slightly. Samuel was my friend, he said quietly. He saved many of our children when Harmon's soldiers came. Morning Star was among them. He studied Mason's face. She has his eyes, you know. Whose eyes? Mason asked, confused. Your eyes. Lone Wolf smiled faintly at Mason's bewilderment. Samuel knew. That is why he named her Morning Star, the brightest light before dawn. In our language, she was called something else. But Samuel saw the truth. Mason felt as though the ground were shifting beneath him. What truth? What are you saying? Lone Wolf placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. Those answers must wait. First, we must ensure there is a tomorrow for such truths to be spoken. His expression grew serious. Rest now. The journey back will be harder than the journey here. As Lone Wolf left him alone in the shelter, Mason sat heavily on a woven mat, his mind reeling. The chief's words hinted at something impossible, a connection between himself and Morningstar that went beyond coincidence or symbol. Could Morningstar somehow be connected to Lucy? The timing was right, 13 years since the fever took his family, 13 years since Samuel had found Morningstar wearing Lucy's bracelet. But how and why had Samuel kept such a secret from him all these years? Mason closed his eyes, exhaustion suddenly washing over him. These questions would have to wait. For now, all that mattered was returning to the farm in time with enough warriors to stop Harmon's attack. Everything else, all the mysteries and half-truths, would mean nothing if Morningstar died before he could learn the full story. Morningstar moved silently through the underground passage, the small oil lamp in her hand casting grotesque shadows on the cave walls. Behind her, Deputy Wright followed with considerably less grace, his wounded shoulder making him awkward in the tight confines of the tunnel. How much further? Wright whispered, his voice echoing slightly despite his attempt at quiet. Not far to the oak tree entrance, Morningstar replied. From there we can see the approach to the farm without being seen. Since Mason's departure hours earlier, she had been showing Wright the cave system, mapping out escape routes and potential ambush points. The deputy had proven himself surprisingly useful despite his injury, offering insights into Harmon's likely tactics and helping to set simple traps around the perimeter of the farm. Morningstar remained cautious in her trust, however. Wright might have turned against Harmon, but he had stood by during years of atrocities. Such a man's loyalty was like a weather vane, it changed with the wind. They reached a narrow vertical shaft with crude handholds carved into the rock. Morningstar extinguished the lamp before climbing upward, emerging behind a screen of boulders and scrub brush near the base of the great oak tree where Samuel was buried. Wright followed, wincing as he pulled himself up with his good arm. From their hidden vantage point, they had a clear view of the approach to the farm, the long dirt road that wound through the valley, the scattered mesquite trees that provided the only cover, and the cabin itself looking small and vulnerable in the afternoon sun. No sign of them yet, Wright murmured, scanning the horizon. But they'll come. Harmon's not a man to let a slight go unanswered. And what was the slight? Morningstar asked, a rare edge of bitterness in her voice. That we dared to live, that Samuel refused to sell sacred land. Wright had the decency to look ashamed. Harmon sees the world differently. Everything is either his or in his way. He adjusted his wounded arm with a grimace. I didn't see it clearly until recently. Or maybe I didn't want to see it. Morningstar studied him, wondering at the change in the man. Why did you really turn against him, deputy? You stood by for years while he killed my people. Wright was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. I came west to escape the war, he finally said. I'd been a chaplain in the Union Army, saw too much death, lost my faith. Thought I could find it again in new country. A bitter smile crossed his face. Instead, I found Harmon offering good pay and the chance to civilize the frontier. He sighed heavily. At first, I told myself we were bringing law and order. Then I told myself the Apache raids justified harsh measures. Then I stopped telling myself anything at all. Just followed orders, collected my pay. What changed? Morningstar pressed. Samuel. Wright's expression softened. He would come to town for supplies, treat anyone who needed medical help regardless of race. I saw how the people respected him, white, Mexican, Apache alike. He had something I'd lost: purpose, moral clarity. He turned to meet Morningstar's gaze directly. 3 months ago, I was in his cabin with a bullet in my leg, caught in a crossfire during a raid on a homestead. Samuel patched me up, let me stay while I healed. I saw how he lived with you girls, teaching, learning. Saw a different way of being. Yet you still rode with Harmon when he came to kill us. Morningstar said, her voice cool. Wright's face contorted with shame. I told myself I was just following orders one last time, that I could prevent the worst from happening. He shook his head. I was a coward. By the time I found my courage, Samuel was dead and your sisters were hanging. His voice broke. I'm sorry, it's not enough, but I am sorry. Morningstar said nothing, her expression unreadable. Apologies wouldn't bring back the dead, but actions might yet save the living. She rose to her feet, scanning the horizon once more. Come, we should check the other observation points before sundown. As they made their way back to the cave entrance, Wright suddenly grabbed her arm, pulling her down behind a boulder. Look, he whispered, pointing toward a distant ridge. Morningstar narrowed her eyes, focusing on the spot. There a brief flash of light like sun reflecting off metal, then another. Scouts, Wright said grimly. Harmon's advance party taking positions. The main force won't be far behind. How long do we have? An hour, maybe less. Wright's expression was grim. They'll wait until dusk to attack. Harmon likes the psychological advantage of fading light, makes defenders jumpy, prone to mistakes. Morningstar calculated quickly. Mason had been gone just 6 hours. Even if he'd reached the Apache camp, even if Lone Wolf agreed to help, they wouldn't arrive until well after nightfall. She and Wright would have to hold out alone against Harmon's first assault. We need to get back to the cabin, she said, already moving toward the cave entrance. Set the final traps. They descended into the darkness once more, moving more quickly now, despite the risk of noise. Time was running short. As they navigated the twisting passages, Morningstar's mind turned to Mason. Had he reached her people safely? Would Lone Wolf believe him? The chief was her mother's brother, but she had not seen him since Samuel took her in. There was no guarantee he would risk warriors to save a farm owned by a white man. Yet she had sent Mason with the silver bracelet, the token that connected them all in ways Mason did not yet understand. If anything would convince Lone Wolf to help, it would be that small crescent moon and what it represented. Morningstar touched the scar on her wrist, remembering the day Samuel had first shown her the bracelet, explaining its significance. This connects you to a good man, he had said, a man who will someday need to know the truth. That day had finally come, if they survived the night. Mason rode at the head of the Apache war party, Lone Wolf at his side. 20 warriors followed behind them, moving swiftly through the gathering dusk. They had left the camp shortly after sunset, traveling by a route known only to the Apache, a series of hidden trails that cut miles off the journey Mason had taken earlier. We will approach from the east, Lone Wolf had explained, through Spirit Mesa. It will place us behind Harmon's men, who will focus their attack from the road to the west. Now, as the red glow of sunset gave way to deep purple twilight, Mason could see Spirit Mesa looming ahead, a flat-topped mountain with sheer cliff faces that seemed impassable. Yet Lone Wolf led them confidently toward what appeared to be a solid rock wall. Only when they were nearly upon it did Mason see the narrow crevice barely wide enough for a horse to pass through single file. The warriors dismounted, leading their horses into the shadowy passage. "The sacred way," Lone Wolf said quietly, "known only to the people. It leads directly to the caves beneath Samuel's farm." The passage twisted through the heart of the mesa, sometimes so narrow that Mason had to turn sideways to squeeze through with his horse. The absolute darkness was broken only by the occasional flicker of starlight from fissures high above. Yet the Apache moved with absolute confidence, as if they could see in the dark or had memorized every turn of the path. After what seemed like hours but was likely only 40 minutes, Mason detected a change in the air, a freshness that suggested they were nearing an exit. Ahead, Lone Wolf had stopped, raising his hand for silence. "Listen," the chief whispered. Mason strained his ears. At first he heard nothing but the soft breathing of the horses and the slight shifting of equipment. Then it came to him, faint but unmistakable. Gunshots. The attack on the farm had already begun. Lone Wolf's expression hardened. "They came earlier than you expected." "Harmon must have changed his plans," Mason replied, anxiety tightening his chest. "We need to hurry. The cave exit is just ahead. It will bring us out near the burial oak." Lone Wolf turned to address his warriors in their own language, giving quick instructions. They nodded grimly, checking weapons and preparing for battle. To Mason, Lone Wolf said, "My men will spread out through the cave system, emerging at different points to surround Harmon's forces. You and I will go directly to the cabin to find Morningstar." The plan made tactical sense, but Mason couldn't help wondering if they were already too late. The gunfire had been sporadic but intense, a fierce exchange rather than the one-sided execution he had feared. At least that meant Morningstar and Wright were still fighting. They moved forward more quickly, now the passage widening into a proper cave. Soon Mason could see a faint glow ahead, starlight from the cave entrance. Lone Wolf signaled for silence as they approached the warriors spreading out behind them. The cave opened beneath the same cluster of boulders where Mason had found Morningstar, showing Wright the observation point earlier that day. From this vantage, they had a clear view of the farm below and the battle raging around it. Muzzle flashes punctuated the darkness like fireflies concentrated around the cabin and barn. Harmon's men had established a perimeter firing from covered positions, while return fire came from the cabin itself, and surprisingly from several points around the property. "Your friend and Morningstar have set an effective defense," Lone Wolf observed. "They fight like cornered wolves, making the enemy pay for every step." Mason nodded, pride mingling with concern. Morningstar was proving as resourceful as he'd hoped, using the cave entrances to create the illusion of multiple defenders. But how long could two people maintain such a deception against 20 armed men? Lone Wolf issued quiet commands, and the warriors began slipping away in groups of 2 and 3, heading for different cave entrances. Soon only Mason and the chief remained at the observation point. "Now we go to the cabin," Lone Wolf said, checking his rifle, an old but well-maintained Springfield that had likely been taken from a fallen soldier years ago. "Stay close. The night eyes of my people will protect us." They descended swiftly, using the darkness and the scattered gunfire to cover their movement. Twice they froze as Harmon's men passed nearby too, focused on the cabin to notice the two figures slipping between shadows. They reached the back of the cabin undetected. Mason tapped softly on the rear window. 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones, the signal he and Morningstar had arranged before his departure. For a long moment there was no response. Then the window slid open silently, and Morningstar's face appeared barely visible in the darkness. "Mason," she whispered, relief evident in her voice. Then her eyes widened as she recognized his companion. "Uncle?" "Quickly," Lone Wolf said, gesturing them inside. "There is no time for reunions." They climbed through the window into the darkened cabin. Inside, Deputy Wright was positioned at the front window, firing occasionally to maintain the illusion of a strong defense. He turned at their entrance, gun raised, then lowered it upon recognizing Mason. "You made it," Wright said, genuine relief in his voice. "And you brought help." 20 warriors, Mason confirmed. "They're moving into position through the caves." Wright nodded. "Good. We're outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Harmon brought at least 15 men, maybe more." Where is Harmon himself? Lone Wolf asked, his voice hardening. Directing from the road, Wright replied, keeping his distance as usual, letting others take the risks. A sudden increase in gunfire from the north side of the property interrupted their conversation. The Apache warriors had begun their counterattack, catching Harmon's men in a crossfire. It's working, Morningstar said, a fierce smile crossing her face. They're confused, shooting at shadows. Indeed, shouts of alarm could be heard as Harmon's men realized they were being flanked by unseen attackers. The disciplined fire pattern broke down into chaotic, panicked shooting. Now is the time to end this, Lone Wolf said grimly, to cut out the disease at its root. Harmon, Mason understood, but he'll be heavily guarded. Not for long, Lone Wolf gestured toward the increasing chaos outside. His men will scatter like quail when they realize they are surrounded. Harmon will be exposed. Wright checked his revolver. I know where he'll retreat to. There's an old line shack about a half-mile up the road. It's his fallback position. Mason nodded decisively. Then that's where we'll go. He turned to Morningstar. You stay here, it's too dangerous. Her eyes flashed defiantly. This is my fight too. Samuel died protecting me. My sisters died because of Harmon. I have earned the right to see justice done. Before Mason could argue further, a tremendous crash came from the front of the cabin as something heavy struck the door. The barricade they had constructed shuddered but held. They're making a direct assault, Wright warned, moving back to his position at the window. Trying to rush us while their men provide covering fire. Mason and Lone Wolf took up positions at the other windows, rifles ready. Outside, shadowy figures darted between cover, working their way closer to the cabin. For several tense minutes, the four defenders repelled the assault with carefully placed shots, forcing Harmon's men back. The Apache warriors continued their harassment from multiple positions, creating confusion and preventing any coordinated attack. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the assault faltered. Harmon's men began to withdraw, some fleeing outright, others providing covering fire for an organized retreat. They're pulling back, Wright observed, peering cautiously through the window. Harmon must have ordered a withdrawal. To the line shack, Mason surmised. He's cutting his losses. Lone Wolf's expression was cold and determined. Then we follow. Tonight it ends. They exited through the rear window, moving swiftly but cautiously through the darkness. The sounds of fighting had diminished, replaced by the calls of Apache warriors signaling to each other. Harmon's forces were in full retreat, abandoning the farm in disarray. Wright led them toward the road, staying low and using the terrain for cover. The line shack is just beyond that rise, he whispered, pointing toward a low hill silhouetted against the starlit sky. As they crested the hill, they saw the shack, a simple one-room structure used by line riders watching over cattle. A lantern glowed in its single window, and 4 horses were tied outside. Harmon had indeed retreated there, but not alone. 4 men, Mason murmured, Harmon and 3 others. His most loyal dogs, Wright said with disgust, the ones who've done his worst work. Lone Wolf surveyed the situation with the experienced eye of a warrior. No back door, 1 window, poor defensive position. He nodded slightly. They do not expect to be pursued so quickly. They withdrew slightly to formulate a plan. The simple approach would be to surround the shack and call for surrender. But Mason doubted Harmon would give up without a fight that might claim more lives. As they deliberated, Morningstar suddenly stiffened, her head tilting, as if listening to something only she could hear. What is it? Mason asked quietly. The land, she whispered. It speaks. Before Mason could question her meaning, the ground beneath them trembled slightly, a subtle vibration that might have been mistaken for distant thunder or a passing herd. But the sky was clear and no cattle roamed nearby. The cave, Morningstar said, her eyes widening. The great chamber beneath the line shack. It's unstable. Wright looked confused, but Lone Wolf nodded in understanding. The sacred caves extend this far. Yes, Samuel mapped them. Morningstar turned to Mason. There is another way, a way without more bloodshed. She quickly explained what she had in mind. It was dangerous, requiring perfect timing, but if it worked, it would end the confrontation without risking more lives. Mason hesitated. You're sure about the cave ceiling? Samuel documented it in his journal. The chamber beneath the shack has collapsed twice in the past. The rock is thin, unstable. With the right pressure, she left the implication hanging. After a moment's consideration, Mason nodded. Let's do it. While Lone Wolf and Morningstar circled around to approach the shack from the front, a distraction that would focus attention outward. Mason and Wright made their way to the cave entrance Morningstar had indicated, hidden in a dry wash 50 yards behind the shack. The entrance was narrow and well concealed as she had described. They squeezed through, finding themselves in a low passage that sloped downward. "How far to the chamber beneath the shack?" Mason whispered. "Not far," Wright replied, surprising Mason with his knowledge. "I've been in these caves before. Samuel showed me some of them during my recovery." They proceeded cautiously, using only the faintest light from a small candle Wright had brought. The passage widened as they descended, eventually opening into a large chamber with a ceiling that rose at least 20 feet above them. Wright pointed upward. "That's directly beneath the shack. See the cracks in the ceiling? Morningstar is right, it's unstable." Mason studied the ceiling. Long fissures spread like spider webs across the rock, and in places the stone looked thin enough that light from the shack's lantern filtered through faintly. "How do we trigger a collapse?" he asked. Wright moved to one side of the chamber, where several support columns of natural stone connected floor to ceiling. Samuel said these are the key. They're the only things holding up this section of the cave. "Remove them, and the whole thing comes down," Mason finished. He examined the nearest column critically. "We'd need explosives to do that. Or this." Wright indicated a small stream that ran along one side of the chamber, disappearing into a crack in the wall. Samuel said this underwater river is what created the cave in the first place, dissolving the limestone. It still rises during heavy rains, weakening the columns further. Mason followed Wright's gaze to a crude dam of stones that had been constructed to contain the stream. "If we break that, the water flows to the lowest point at the base of the columns," Wright confirmed. "It won't cause an immediate collapse, but it will weaken the structure enough that a few well-placed shots from below could bring down the ceiling." It was a sound plan, but timing would be crucial. They needed to ensure Harmon was in the shack when it collapsed, while also giving themselves enough time to escape the cave before the ceiling came down. "We need a signal," Mason said. "Something to let us know when Lone Wolf and Morningstar have Harmon's attention." As if in answer, three distinct owl calls sounded from above Morningstar's signal that they were in position. "That's our cue," Wright said, already moving toward the stone dam. "Help me with these rocks." Together they dismantled the dam, allowing the stream to flow freely across the chamber floor. The water found the low points as predicted, pooling around the bases of the support columns. "Now we wait," Wright said, checking his watch. Samuel's notes said it takes about 15 minutes for the water to do its work. Those 15 minutes stretched like hours as they stood in the dimly lit cave, listening to the faint sounds of voices from above. Occasionally they could make out words, Harmon's distinctive cultured tones, giving orders, the responses of his men, and once Morningstar's clear voice calling out a challenge. "Time," Wright finally said, returning his watch to his pocket. "The columns should be weakened enough now." Mason raised his rifle, aiming carefully at the base of the nearest column where the water had been doing its work. "On three. 1, 2, 3. Their shots echoed thunderously in the confined space, the bullets striking the softened stone with devastating effect. Cracks spiderwebbed up the column, and small pieces began to fall. "Again," Mason ordered. Their second volley brought down the first column entirely. A deep, rumbling sound filled the chamber as the ceiling shifted, more cracks appearing across its surface. "Time to go," Wright said urgently, already backing toward the exit passage. Mason didn't need to be told twice. They retreated hastily as the rumbling increased, dust and small stones raining down around them. Behind them, the chamber's ceiling was giving way in sections, the collapse spreading rapidly toward the shack above. They had just reached the narrow entrance passage when a deafening crash announced the complete failure of the cave ceiling. The ground shook beneath their feet, and a cloud of dust billowed from the chamber, enveloping them. Coughing and half blind, they squeezed through the passage and emerged into the cool night air. From the direction of the line shack came the sounds of splintering wood and men's shouts of alarm. Mason and Wright circled around to approach from the front, where they found Lone Wolf and Morningstar, watching as the shack slowly tilted and then collapsed into the sinkhole that had opened beneath it. Dust rose in a great cloud, illuminated eerily by the lantern that somehow remained lit amidst the destruction. As the dust began to settle, they could see that half the shack had fallen into the collapsed cave, while the other half teetered on the edge. Of Harmon and his men, There was no sign. Did they escape? Mason asked, scanning the surrounding area. Lone Wolf shook his head. They were inside when it began. Two men jumped through the window, but Harmon and another remained. Even as he spoke, a groan came from the wreckage. Morningstar moved forward cautiously, peering into the partially collapsed structure. There, she said, pointing, trapped under the beam. Mason joined her, entering the tilted shack carefully. The lantern still burned on its hook, swinging gently and casting moving shadows across the scene. Beneath a heavy roof beam lay Theodore Harmon, his lower body pinned blood staining his silver hair. Nearby, another man lay motionless, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. Harmon's eyes fluttered open as Mason approached, focusing with difficulty. "Reed," he rasped, "should have killed you when you first arrived." "Probably," Mason agreed, kneeling beside the trapped man. A quick assessment told him Harmon's injuries were severe, likely fatal. The beam had crushed his chest and abdomen. "You've lost Harmon," Mason said quietly. "Your men are scattered or dead. The farm remains standing." Harmon's laugh turned into a wet cough, blood speckling his lips. "The farm? You think this was about a worthless patch of dirt?" His eyes blazed with feverish intensity. "This was about cleansing, about justice." "Justice?" Morningstar had entered behind Mason, her voice cold. "You murdered 7 innocent women, hung them like animals." Harmon's gaze shifted to her, hatred contorting his features. "Innocent, your people killed my wife, my sons, butchered them while I was away." His voice broke. "My youngest was only 4. They took his scalp while he still breathed." "That was not my people," Morningstar replied evenly. "That was Comanche 15 years ago. Yet you've slaughtered Apache ever since, claiming vengeance for something we never did." "All the same," Harmon muttered, his strength visibly fading. "All savages in the end." Lone Wolf appeared in the doorway, his face impassive as he surveyed the scene. "This man's hatred has consumed him. There is nothing left but the shell." "You're right," Mason said, rising to his feet, "and I won't let his hatred claim one more life." He turned to Morningstar. "We'll leave him here. Let the land he tried to desecrate claim him." Morningstar hesitated, then nodded slowly. "The ancestors will judge him now." As they turned to leave, Harmon's voice stopped them, weaker now, but filled with malice. "She looks like you, Reed, around the eyes. Samuel knew. That's why he kept her from you all these years, afraid of what you'd become if you knew the truth." Mason froze, turning back slowly. "What truth?" Harmon's bloodied lips curved in a grotesque smile. "Ask her about the fever, about what really happened to your wife and daughter." His eyes shifted to Morningstar. "Ask her why she wears your dead child's bracelet." Before Mason could respond, the shack groaned ominously as more of the ground gave way beneath it. "Out," Lone Wolf commanded, pulling Morningstar toward the door. "Now." They barely cleared the structure before it collapsed completely into the sinkhole, burying Harmon and his man beneath tons of wood and earth. The lantern shattered, its flame extinguished in an instant, leaving them in darkness, broken only by starlight. For a long moment, no one spoke. The night was suddenly quiet, the distant sounds of combat having ceased. Harmon's remaining men had fled or been captured by the Apache warriors. Finally, Mason turned to Morningstar, whose face was a pale oval in the darkness. "What did he mean?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "About the fever, about my daughter." Morningstar's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It is a long story, Mason Reed, one that should be told by firelight with Samuel's journal open before us." She took his hand gently. "Come back to the farm. There I will tell you everything." The cabin was a welcome sight after the night's violence. Apache warriors had secured the perimeter, tending to their wounded and gathering the dead. Of Harmon's 15 men, 6 had been killed, 8 captured, and the remainder had fled into the night. The Apache had suffered only minor injuries. Their knowledge of the terrain and surprise attack had given them a decisive advantage. Deputy Wright's shoulder wound had reopened during the cave operation, but Morningstar rebandaged it with practiced hands. Inside the cabin, Mason built a fire in the hearth, while Morningstar retrieved Samuel's hidden journal, not the one Mason had read earlier, but a smaller, more personal volume that Samuel had kept in a hollowed-out book on his bedside table. Lone Wolf joined them, sitting cross-legged by the fire, his weathered face solemn in the golden light. Wright positioned himself by the window, keeping watch more from habit than necessity. Morningstar opened the journal carefully, turning to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Samuel wanted you to know everything, Mason. He was waiting for the right time. She took a deep breath. Now that time has come. She began to read aloud Samuel's words, filling the quiet cabin. October 12th, 1862. Today I met a young soldier named Mason Reed on the bloodiest field I have ever witnessed. Antietam has claimed thousands, but this one man I could save. Something in his eyes spoke of a greater purpose unfulfilled. I do not know what fate has in store for him, but I felt compelled to do everything in my power to ensure he lived to discover it. Morningstar turned several pages forward. April 3rd, 1865. News reached us today that the war is effectively over. I think of the young soldier Reed, often wonder if he survived the remaining campaigns. I have kept the few letters we exchanged. He spoke of returning to his wife Catherine and infant daughter Lucy in Pennsylvania. Perhaps in peacetime our paths will cross again. More pages turn, the dates advancing. June 18th, 1867. A letter arrived today that has shaken me to my core. Mason Reed's brother-in-law searching for him. According to this, James Winters Mason's wife and daughter fell ill with yellow fever in the summer of 18th. The town doctor, a man named Ellis, treated them with what he claimed was quinine. Mason was away selling grain. Morningstar's voice faltered slightly as she continued. The treatment made them worse. When Mason returned, both were near death. Catherine passed first. Little Lucy lingered, burning with fever. In desperation, Mason sought help from a traveling Apache woman who had a reputation for healing. She tried traditional remedies, but it seemed too late. Mason leaned forward, every muscle tense. This aligned with his fragmented memories of those terrible days, the town doctor's ineffective treatments, his own desperate search for alternatives, finding the Apache healer passing through town. Mason apparently collapsed from exhaustion and grief. When he woke, both Catherine and Lucy were gone, presumably dead. He fell into despair, sold everything, and vanished. Winters has been searching for him for nearly a year, bearing news too important to entrust to paper. He asked if my army contacts could help locate Mason. I promised to try, though I fear finding a man who does not wish to be found. Morningstar turned to the next entry, dated 2 weeks later. June 30th, 1867. Winters arrived today with a story beyond belief. The Apache healer, seeing that little Lucy might yet be saved but would be orphaned in a town hostile to her mother's people, took the child when she seemed to die. In truth, Lucy's fever broke later that night, miles from town. The healer, who was called Spotted Fawn, decided the girl would have a better chance with her people than in a white town with a father lost to grief. Mason's heart hammered against his ribs. "What is he saying?" he whispered. Morningstar met his gaze steadily. That Lucy did not die that night. With trembling fingers, she turned to the next page. Winters tracked Spotted Fawn to her village in Arizona Territory, only to find she had been killed in a cavalry attack led by a Captain Harmon. Before dying, she had entrusted the white child to her sister, who renamed the girl according to their customs. Winters could not determine the child's fate after the village was destroyed, but he brought me this. Morningstar reached into her pocket and withdrew Lucy's silver bracelet, found among Spotted Fawn's possessions. He hoped I might use my connections in the territory to locate the child if she still lives. Mason sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter the moment. And did Samuel find her? Read the final entry, Lone Wolf said quietly, speaking for the first time since Morningstar began reading. Morningstar turned to the last written page, dated just 1 month before Mason's arrival. After 13 years, the circle closes. Mason's letter arrived today, responding at last to my offer of the farm. He will come soon. How do I tell a father that the daughter he grieved for 13 years ago is alive? That she has been raised Apache, no longer remembers her first language or her birth parents? That the cavalry officer who tried to claim this land is the same man who orphaned her a second time? Morning star. My morning star, the brightest light of my declining years, is both Lucy Reed and Singing Brook of the Chiricahua. She carries 2 worlds within her, just as this land does. When Mason comes, I will show him this journal. We will find a way forward together, healing the wounds of the past. Morningstar closed the journal gently. In the silence that followed, only the crackling of the fire could be heard. Mason stared at her, this young woman he had known for barely 2 days, searching her features for any trace of the 5-year-old daughter he had lost. Was it possible? Could Lucy have survived, been taken by the healer raised among the Apache? The bracelet, he said, finally, his voice barely audible. It left a scar on your wrist. Morningstar Lucy nodded. Spotted Fawn kept it on me as proof of my identity, but as I grew, it became too tight. By the time she removed it, it had left this mark. She touched the crescent-shaped scar. After she died, I wore it on a cord around my neck until Samuel found me. You were 6 when Samuel found you, Mason said slowly. Lucy would have been 11. I was small for my age, she replied, malnourished from the hard times. And Samuel's journal may have the dates wrong. He was reconstructing events from what Winters told him. Lone Wolf leaned forward. I remember when Spotted Fawn brought you to our village. A small white child, fevered and weak. Many thought you would die, but Spotted Fawn nursed you back to health. His expression softened. You learned our ways quickly. Soon many forgot you were not born among us. Mason's mind reeled with conflicting emotions. If this was true, if Morningstar was truly Lucy, then his daughter had been alive all these years while he drowned his grief in whiskey and self-pity. He had abandoned his search too soon, accepted her death too readily. I don't remember, he whispered. I don't remember anything clearly from those days. The fever, the Dr. Catherine dying. He passed a hand over his face. It's all fragments. Grief does that, Morningstar said gently. Samuel told me grief can steal memories, replace them with shadows. Do you remember, Mason asked, meeting her eyes directly. Do you remember anything from before Pennsylvania, Catherine? A flicker of something uncertainty perhaps crossed Morningstar's face. Only impressions. A woman singing. A wooden house with blue curtains. The smell of baking bread. She hesitated. And sometimes in dreams, a man with kind eyes showing me how stars move across the sky. Mason's breath caught. He had indeed taught Lucy about the stars, carrying her out to the fields on clear nights, to show her the constellations. It was such a specific, intimate detail, not something Samuel could have known or told her. Your mother, Mason said softly. Catherine, she sang Greensleeves when she worked. Said it was the only song she knew all the words to. Morningstar closed her eyes, concentrating. After a moment, she began to hum softly a halting, imperfect rendition of Greensleeves. The sound pierced Mason's heart like a physical pain. How many times had he heard Catherine sing that tune as she kneaded bread or mended clothes? How many times had Lucy tried to join in, her childish voice stumbling over the complicated melody? Lucy, he whispered the name, feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on his lips. Morningstar Lucy opened her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. I don't know who I am anymore, she confessed. Morningstar or Lucy Reed, Apache or White, I feel torn between worlds. Lone Wolf spoke, his deep voice gentle but firm. You are both child, just as the sky at dawn is both night and day, just as this land is both Apache and New American. You need not choose. Mason wanted to reach for her, to embrace his long-lost daughter, but he held back, sensing her confusion and turmoil. 13 years had passed. She had built a life and identity. He could not simply reclaim her as if those years hadn't happened. Samuel was right to wait, Mason said finally, to let us find our way to this truth together. He met Morningstar's Lucy's gaze steadily. I won't ask you to be someone you don't remember being, but I would like the chance to know you as you are now. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. I would like that too. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only when Deputy Wright cleared his throat from his position by the window. Dawn's coming, he said, nodding toward the eastern horizon, where the first faint lightening of the sky was visible. What happens now? It was a good question. With Harmon dead and his men defeated, the immediate danger had passed. But the aftermath of the night's violence would bring consequences, questions from territorial authorities, decisions about the fate of the captured men, and the future of the farm itself. First, we honor our dead, Lone Wolf said decisively, both those who fell tonight and those who died before Samuel and the 7 Knowledge Keepers. And then, Mason asked, then we protect what Samuel died for. Morningstar said, her voice finding new strength. The sacred caves, the knowledge of the 7 tribes, the path between worlds that this land represents. Mason nodded slowly, understanding dawning. This was what Samuel had meant in his final note, complete what I could not my final responsibility to you." He hadn't just been asking Mason to protect Morning Star. He had been passing on a greater purpose, a mission to preserve something precious that straddled two worlds just as Morning Star herself did. "We'll need help," Mason said, looking from Morning Star to Lone Wolf to Wright. "All of us working together." "You have it," Lone Wolf assured him. "My warriors will support what Samuel began here." "And you'll have me," Wright added, "for whatever that's worth, Morning Star." He would need time to think of her as Lucy smiled faintly. "It's worth more than you know, Deputy." Samuel believed in second chances, in redemption. As the first golden rays of sunrise spilled across the horizon, illuminating the farm with new light, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in 13 years, a sense of purpose, of belonging. The weight of grief that had pressed down on him for so long seemed lighter somehow, not gone but transformed. There would be challenges ahead. Morning Star would need time to reconcile her dual identity. Mason would need to learn how to be a father to a daughter who had grown up in a culture vastly different from his own. The territorial authorities would demand explanations for the night's events. But for now, in this moment of new dawn, Mason allowed himself to feel something like hope. Samuel had given him far more than a farm. He had given him back a future. The rising sun bathed the farm in golden light, transforming the night's battlefield into a strangely peaceful landscape. Apache warriors moved silently around the property, tending to their wounded and performing brief ceremonies over fallen comrades. The bodies of Harmon's men had been respectfully covered and laid in a row near the barn, awaiting proper burial. Mason stood on the porch watching this solemn activity with a mixture of relief and disbelief. They had survived. Against overwhelming odds, they had held the farm and defeated Harmon. But the victory had come at a cost, and the revelations of the night had left him reeling. Morning Star Lucy, his daughter, alive after all these years. The truth was still too vast to fully comprehend, too miraculous to quite believe. Yet the evidence was compelling: Samuel's journal, the silver bracelet, the fragments of memory that Morning Star had described. She emerged from the cabin to join him, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. Her face showed the fatigue of the long night, but her eyes were clear and direct as she handed him one of the cups. "You haven't slept," she observed. "Neither have you, Ken," Mason replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the activity below. Lone Wolf was directing his warriors, his commanding presence evident even from a distance. Deputy Wright sat on a stump near the barn, rebandaging his wounded shoulder with the help of a young Apache warrior. "What happens now?" Morning Star asked quietly. It was the question that had kept Mason awake through what remained of the night. What did happen now? The immediate danger had passed, but the aftermath would bring its own challenges. The territorial authorities would investigate the deaths of Harmon and his men. Questions would be asked, explanations would be demanded, and beyond those practical concerns lay more personal ones. If Morning Star was truly Lucy, what did that mean for both of them? Could they rebuild a relationship across 13 years of separation and vastly different life experiences? Did she even want to? "I don't know," Mason admitted, "but whatever comes, we'll face it together." He hesitated, then added, "If that's what you want." Morning Star considered this, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the mesas stood silhouetted against the brightening sky. "I have been many people," she said finally, "digging brook to my Apache family. Morning Star to Samuel. Perhaps Lucy before that." She turned to look at him directly. "I don't know if I can be the daughter you remember." "I wouldn't ask you to be," Mason said gently. "Too much time has passed. We've both changed." He met her gaze steadily. "But perhaps we can learn who we are to each other now." A small smile softened her features. "I would like that." Their moment of connection was interrupted by the arrival of Lone Wolf, who climbed the porch steps with the fluid grace that belied his age. "The bodies of our fallen warriors have been prepared for the journey home," he announced. "We will take them to Spirit Mesa for proper burial." "And Harmon's men?" Mason asked. "Those who died fighting will be buried with respect," Lone Wolf replied. "Even an enemy deserves dignity in death. The prisoners will be taken to Redemption Creek to face the white man's justice." Mason nodded, appreciating the chief's wisdom and restraint. It would have been easy for the Apache to exact harsh vengeance after years of persecution, but Lone Wolf understood that such a path would only perpetuate the cycle of violence. "There is something else we must discuss." Lone Wolf continued, his expression grave. The caves, the sacred ground. With Samuel gone, who will protect them? It was the central question, the one that had driven Samuel's actions for years. The silver deposit beneath the farm made the land valuable to men like Harmon, but the cultural and spiritual significance made it priceless to the Apache. The land is legally mine now, Mason said slowly. Samuel left it to me in his will, but I believe he intended it as a trust, not a possession. He looked from Lone Wolf to Morning Star. This place should belong to both worlds just as Morning Star does. What are you suggesting? Lone Wolf asked, his eyes keen with interest. A covenant, Mason replied, the idea taking shape as he spoke. A formal agreement between myself and your people. The farm remains as it is, a place where both cultures can meet. The caves are preserved, protected from mining or development. And Morning Star. He glanced at her. If she's willing, continues Samuel's work of preserving the knowledge of the 7 tribes. Morning Star's eyes widened slightly. You would do this? It's what Samuel would have wanted, Mason said. And I think it's right. This land has seen too much bloodshed. Perhaps now it can be a place of healing instead. Lone Wolf considered this proposal, his weathered face unreadable. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. Such a covenant would honor our ancestors in Samuel's memory. He extended his hand to Mason. Let it be so. As they clasped hands, sealing the agreement in the simple, direct manner of the frontier, Deputy Wright approached the porch. Riders coming, he announced, pointing toward the road. Looks like the sheriff from Redemption Creek in a posse. Mason's stomach tightened. The reckoning had arrived sooner than expected. How many? 6, including the sheriff, Wright replied, most likely responding to reports of gunfire. Lone Wolf's expression hardened. Sheriff Davis is Harmon's man. He will not look kindly on what happened here. Then we need to control the narrative, Mason said decisively. Wright, you're known in town. You'll speak. First explain that Harmon was planning to illegally seize my property. Wright nodded grimly. I'll tell the truth that I tried to warn you got shot for my trouble, and that Harmon brought armed men to attack a legal property owner. What about us? Lone Wolf asked, gesturing to his warriors. The sheriff will see Apache and assume the worst. You were invited guests, Mason replied firmly, helping to defend my property against armed trespassers. He turned to Morning Star. Stay close to me. As Samuel's ward, and now my daughter, you have every right to be here. She nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes at being publicly identified as Mason's daughter for the first time. They descended the porch steps together, forming a united front as the riders approached. The warriors gathered behind them, not threatening, but present a clear statement that this land was under their protection as well. Sheriff Davis was a barrel-chested man with a drooping mustache and small, suspicious eyes. He reined his horse to a stop several yards away, surveying the scene with obvious displeasure. What in God's name happened here, Wright? He demanded, ignoring Mason and the others. Reports of gunfire all night, and now I find you consorting with Indians. Wright stepped forward, his deputy's badge still pinned to his blood-stained shirt. Mayor Harmon led an illegal attack on this property. Sheriff, Mr. Reed here is the legal owner, inherited from his uncle, Samuel Reed. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as they shifted to Mason. Where's the mayor now? Dead, Mason replied evenly. He and his men attempted to force their way into my home. When that failed, they retreated to the line shack up the road, which collapsed due to unstable ground beneath it. Convenient, the sheriff said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. And I suppose these savages had nothing to do with it. He gestured contemptuously toward the Apache. Lone Wolf stepped forward, his dignity making the sheriff's bluster seem petty by comparison. Chief Lone Wolf of the Chiricahua Apache, he introduced himself formally. I and my warriors were invited guests of Mr. Reed, helping to defend his property against armed attackers. The sheriff sneered. Since when do Apache need an invitation to kill white men? That's enough, Davis, Wright said sharply. Chief Lone Wolf is telling the truth. I was here. I saw everything. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded document. And this proves Reed's legal ownership of the property. The sheriff reluctantly accepted the paper, Samuel's will properly witnessed and filed with the territorial court. He scanned it briefly, his frown deepening. This all seems mighty suspicious, he muttered, returning the document. The mayor and a dozen men dead or missing, and I'm supposed to believe it was all legal and proper. Believe what you want, Mason replied calmly, but the facts are clear. Harmon attacked my property with armed men. We defended ourselves as is our right under territorial law. And these men, Davis gestured to where the Apache warriors had gathered the surviving members of Harmon's force. Prisoners, Mason explained. They participated in an illegal attack and will face justice. You're welcome to take them back to town for proper trial. The sheriff seemed taken aback by this reasonable offer. He had clearly expected resistance, perhaps even a confrontation that would justify further action against the farm and its defenders. I'll need statements, he said finally, his tone still suspicious but less openly hostile. From all of you, and I'll be reporting this to the territorial governor. By all means, Mason agreed. In fact, I'd like to send a letter to the governor myself along with some evidence Samuel collected regarding certain illegal activities in Redemption Creek. At the mention of evidence, the sheriff's face paled slightly. Like many in Harmon's inner circle, he likely had secrets to protect. That won't be necessary, he said quickly. I'm sure the governor has more important matters to attend to than local disputes. Perhaps, Mason conceded, but I think he might be interested in learning how the mayor of Redemption Creek conducted business. He met the sheriff's gaze steadily. Don't you, Bum? The threat, though subtle, was clear. If the sheriff pursued the matter further, Samuel's evidence about Harmon's crimes and possibly those of his associates would come to light. After a tense moment, Davis nodded curtly. I'll take the prisoners. Have Wright bring his statement to town when he's able. He turned to his deputies. Secure those men. We're heading back. As the sheriff and his posse gathered the prisoners, Wright approached Mason with a look of grudging admiration. Well played, he said quietly. Davis is a coward at heart. He won't risk his own neck now that Harmon's gone. Let's hope you're right, Mason replied. But I meant what I said about the evidence. If necessary, we'll use it. Once the sheriff and his men had departed with their prisoners, Lone Wolf turned to Mason. You handled that well, he observed, but this is only the beginning. There will be more questions, more challenges. I know, Mason acknowledged, but for now we've bought ourselves some time, and we have the law on our side. Morningstar, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, now spoke. What about the covenant? Will it hold against such challenges? It will if we make it official, Mason said thoughtfully. A legal document filed with the territorial court recognizing the historical and cultural significance of this land and establishing protections for it. The white man's courts have rarely protected Apache interests. Lone Wolf noted skepticism evident in his tone. Then we'll use both systems, Mason suggested. A legal document for the white authorities and a traditional covenant ceremony for your people. Both equally binding. The idea seemed to appeal to Lone Wolf, who nodded slowly. A bridge between worlds, just as Samuel tried to build, just as Morningstar represents. Morningstar herself looked thoughtful. Such a covenant would need witnesses from both sides, people of standing who could affirm its legitimacy. I know a judge in Tucson who served with Samuel during the war, Mason said, and the new Indian agent for the territory is said to be more sympathetic than his predecessor. And I can bring the Council of Elders, Lone Wolf added. The 7 tribes should be represented to honor the knowledge keepers who died. As they discussed the practicalities of the covenant, Mason felt a growing sense of purpose. This was what Samuel had been working toward, not just protecting the land, but creating a lasting peace between two cultures that had been locked in conflict for generations. And perhaps in building this bridge between worlds, Mason could also begin to bridge the years of separation between himself and the daughter he had thought lost forever. The days following the battle passed in a blur of activity. The Apache warriors departed for their home in Black Canyon, taking their fallen comrades and the bodies of the 7 knowledge keepers for proper burial in the sacred grounds of Spirit Mesa. Lone Wolf remained behind with a small honor guard, helping to restore order to the farm and planning for the covenant ceremony. Deputy Wright returned to Redemption Creek to give his statement to the authorities and to monitor the situation in town. Without Harmon's leadership, the community was in disarray, power vacuums forming as various factions vied for control. The mining interests are pressing hardest, Wright reported during one of his visits to the farm. They've already sent telegrams to the territorial capital, seeking permission to survey the area. The land is legally mine, Mason reminded him. They can't survey without permission. Legal ownership hasn't stopped them before, Wright replied grimly. That's why this covenant is so important. It needs to be ironclad with enough influential supporters that even the mining companies won't challenge it. Mason had been working on the legal document drafting and redrafting with input from Lone Wolf and Morningstar. It needed to balance protection of the sacred caves with practical considerations for maintaining the farm as a viable operation. Morningstar proved invaluable in this process. Her years with Samuel had given her a unique understanding of both cultures and their legal systems. She could articulate Apache concerns in terms the white authorities would understand and translate white legal concepts into forms that would resonate with the tribal elders. As they worked together, Mason found himself increasingly impressed by his daughter's intelligence and maturity. This was not the 5-year-old girl he remembered, but a young woman of 18 with a wisdom beyond her years. Yet there were moments, a certain tilt of her head, a particular expression when she was concentrating that sent pangs of recognition through him. Catherine's gestures lived on in their daughter, preserved across time and transformation. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mesas in shades of gold and crimson, Mason broached the subject that had been weighing on his mind. "What do you remember?" he asked gently. "About your life before Samuel." Morningstar was silent for a long moment, her eyes on the distant horizon. "Fragments," she finally said. "Like pieces of a dream. I remember a woman's voice singing, a wooden rocking horse with a red mane, the smell of apple pies cooling on a windowsill." She turned to look at him. "Are these real memories or stories I've created from what Samuel told me?" "They're real," Mason confirmed, his throat tight with emotion. "Your mother made the best apple pies in the county, and I carved that rocking horse for your 3rd birthday." A small smile touched Morningstar's lips. "Then I do remember. Not everything, but something." "Do you remember your name?" Mason asked. "Being called Lucy." She shook her head slowly. "No. I've been singing Brooke and Morningstar for as long as I can recall clearly." She hesitated. "Does that disappoint you?" "No," Mason assured her quickly. "Names are just words. What matters is who you are inside." He paused, then added hesitantly, "Though I admit I don't know what to call you now." "Morningstar is the name Samuel gave me," she replied thoughtfully. "It connects me to him, to the years we shared. But Lucy connects me to you, to my first family." She looked at him directly. "Perhaps I can be both." "Lucy Morningstar Reed," Mason suggested, "a name that honors all the parts of who you are." She considered this, rolling the name around in her mind. "Lucy Morningstar," she repeated slowly. "Yes, I think that fits." They sat in companionable silence as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky. In the distance, an owl called its lonely cry, echoing across the valley. "There's so much I want to know about you," Mason said eventually. "The years we missed, who you've become." "And there's much I want to know about you," she replied. "About my mother, about the life I might have had." She smiled faintly. "We have time now." Before Mason could respond, hoofbeats sounded from the direction of the road. They both tensed, memories of Harmon's attack still fresh, but relaxed when they recognized Deputy Wright's silhouette against the darkening sky. Wright dismounted quickly, his expression grave as he climbed the porch steps. "Telegram from the territorial governor," he announced without preamble. "He's sending a federal marshal to investigate the disturbance at the Reed farm." Mason frowned. "That was fast. Who reported it?" "Mining interests, most likely," Wright replied. "They have powerful friends in the capital. The marshal is due to arrive day after tomorrow." "Then we need to accelerate our plans," Mason decided. "The covenant must be in place before the marshal arrives." Wright nodded grimly. "I had the same thought. I've already sent word to Judge Hollister in Tucson. He can be here tomorrow if he leaves at first light." "And the Indian agent?" "That's the problem," Wright admitted. "Agent and Parker is away on business in California. Won't be back for at least 2 weeks." Mason exchanged a concerned glance with Morningstar. Without the Indian agent's support, the covenant would lack a crucial official endorsement from the federal government. "What about the Army?" Morningstar suggested. "The commander at Fort Grant knew Samuel, respected him." "Colonel Richards," Mason recalled. Samuel had mentioned the man in his letters, a fair-minded officer who had sometimes intervened to prevent conflicts between settlers and Apache bands. Yes, his support would carry weight. "I can ride to Fort Grant tonight," Wright offered. "It's only 15 miles. If the colonel is willing, he could be here by noon tomorrow." "Do it," Mason decided. "We'll proceed with the ceremony tomorrow afternoon, with or without the marshal's approval." As Wright departed on his urgent mission, Mason turned to Morningstar. "We should inform Lone Wolf. The tribal elders will need time to prepare." She nodded, her expression resolute. "I'll speak with him now, and then I should review Samuel's records once more, ensure we haven't overlooked anything that could strengthen our position." Watching her stride purposefully toward the guest cabin where Lone Wolf was staying, Mason felt a surge of pride. Whatever happened in the days ahead, he knew with certainty that his daughter, this remarkable young woman, bridging two worlds, was equal to the challenge. Dawn broke clear and cooled the sky, a pale canvas painted with streaks of pink and gold. Mason rose early, unable to sleep, as the importance of the day ahead weighed on his mind. He found Morningstar already awake, seated cross-legged on a blanket in the yard facing the rising sun. Her eyes were closed, her breathing slow and measured. Small bundles of herbs smoldered beside her, sending tendrils of fragrant smoke spiraling into the still morning air. Mason recognized the ritual from his army days, a traditional Apache prayer ceremony seeking guidance from the ancestors. He waited at a respectful distance until she opened her eyes and acknowledged his presence with a slight nod. "Did they speak to you?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she replied, rising gracefully to her feet. "They approve of what we are doing. The covenant honors their memory and protects their resting place." A small smile touched her lips. Samuel was there too in the smoke. At least I felt his presence. Mason didn't question this. After all he had experienced in recent days, he was less certain about the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. Perhaps Samuel's spirit did linger, watching over the farm and the daughter he had raised. "Judge Hollister should arrive by mid-morning," Mason said, "and hopefully Colonel Richards with Deputy Wright soon after. Are the tribal elders prepared?" Morningstar nodded. "Lone Wolf sent runners at first light. The representatives of the 7 tribes will gather at Spirit Mesa and journey here together." Her expression grew solemn. "It will be a historic gathering. Not since the Great Council before the white settlers came have all 7 tribes sent elders to the same place." The significance of this wasn't lost on Mason. The Apache tribes had been fractured by decades of warfare, forced relocation, and internal disputes. That they would unite for this ceremony spoke volumes about its importance to them. "There's something else you should know," Morningstar added, her tone more hesitant. "Last night I found another of Samuel's journals, one I hadn't seen before. It contains information about the silver deposit." Mason's interest sharpened. "What kind of information?" "Maps, geological surveys." Samuel was more thorough than I realized. She led him toward the cabin. He wasn't just protecting the caves because of their spiritual significance. He believed mining would destabilize the entire underground system, potentially causing catastrophic collapse. Inside, Morningstar retrieved a leather-bound journal from the bookshelf. Opening it on the table, she revealed detailed hand-drawn maps of the cave system with annotations about rock composition and structural integrity. "See these fault lines?" She traced several red lines that crossed beneath the farm. Samuel believed they're still active. Any major disturbance, like mining operations, could trigger shifts in the bedrock. Mason studied the maps with growing concern. "Like what happened at the line shack, but on a much larger scale." "Exactly. Harmon's men assumed the caves were stable, except for that one weak point. But Samuel's research suggests the entire system is interconnected and fragile." She turned to another page filled with calculations. "According to his estimates, a cave-in could affect up to 10 square miles, including parts of Redemption Creek itself." This was powerful information, scientific evidence that mining the silver would endanger not just the sacred caves, but the surrounding communities as well. It could be the key to convincing the territorial authorities to support the covenant. "This changes our approach," Mason said thoughtfully. "The covenant isn't just about preserving Apache heritage, it's about public safety." Morningstar nodded. "Samuel was building a case based on both cultural and practical concerns. I think that's why he was so thorough in his documentation." As they discussed how best to incorporate this new information into their presentation for the judge, and Colonel Lone Wolf arrived with news. "Riders approaching from the east," he announced, "a military escort by the look of them." Mason and Morningstar hurried outside. In the distance, a group of mounted men in blue uniforms could be seen following the road from Fort Grant. At their head rode Deputy Wright alongside a distinguished-looking officer whom Mason assumed must be Colonel Richards. "Good, Mason said with relief. The colonel came. "Now we just need Judge Hollister." As if on cue, another rider appeared from the western road, a portly man on a sturdy mule, his black coat and formal hat marking him as a member of the judiciary even at a distance. Perfect timing, Morningstar observed with a smile. The east and west arriving together, a good omen according to Apache belief. They moved to the yard to greet their important visitors. Colonel Richards proved to be a tall, imposing man with a salt and pepper beard and keen eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted with military precision, removing his hat as he approached. "Mr. Reed," he greeted Mason formally. "Deputy Wright has explained the situation. I knew your uncle well, a fine man and a true friend to both settlers and Apache alike." His gaze shifted to Morningstar, and a look of recognition crossed his face. "And this must be Morningstar. Samuel spoke of you often during my visits." "Colonel Richards," she acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Judge Hollister joined them, somewhat winded from his journey, but alert and curious. He was older than Mason had expected, with a fringe of white hair surrounding a bald pate and spectacles perched on a bulbous nose. "Mason Reed," he inquired, peering at Mason over his spectacles. "Lawrence Hollister, Territorial Circuit Judge. Served with your uncle at Shiloh." He shook Mason's hand firmly. "Terrible business about Samuel. Fine doctor, finer man." Introductions complete. Mason led the group to the cabin where Morningstar had prepared coffee and a simple meal. As they settled around the large table, the conversation turned to the purpose of their gathering. "This covenant you're proposing," Judge Hollister began, accepting a cup of coffee from Morningstar. "It's unusual to say the least. Private land under dual protection with both legal and tribal oversight." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Can't say I've seen its like before." "That's precisely why it's needed," Mason replied. "This land sits at the intersection of two worlds, of two legal systems. The covenant acknowledges both." "And what of the silver deposit?" Colonel Richards asked directly. "The mining interests in the territory are powerful. They won't easily surrender such a valuable resource. We've recently discovered evidence that mining operations would pose a significant public safety risk." Morningstar explained, producing Samuel's geological journal. "My father Samuel documented unstable fault lines running throughout the cave system." As the colonel and judge examined the journal, Mason outlined their proposal in detail: legal protection for the farm, and cave's recognition of their cultural significance to the Apache, and establishment of a trust to maintain the property as a neutral ground where both cultures could meet and learn from each other. "In essence," Mason concluded, "we're asking for official recognition of what Samuel was already doing unofficially, creating a place of healing and understanding between two peoples who have too often met only in conflict." Judge Hollister removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully. "It's an admirable goal," he conceded. "And with Samuel's geological evidence, I believe we can make a strong case for restricting mining activities on safety grounds alone." He replaced his spectacles. "But the cultural provisions, those will be more challenging to enforce through conventional legal channels. That's why we need the dual approach," Morningstar emphasized. "The covenant must have standing in both systems to be truly effective." Colonel Richards nodded slowly. "I've seen enough of this territory to know that peace between settlers and Apache benefits everyone. If this covenant can contribute to that peace, it has my support." He turned to Lone Wolf, who had remained largely silent during the discussion. "Chief, what do your people hope to gain from this arrangement?" Lone Wolf met the colonel's gaze directly. "Protection for our ancestors' resting places, preservation of knowledge that would otherwise be lost, and recognition, acknowledgement that our ways and beliefs have value in this new world being built around us." The colonel considered this, then nodded respectfully. "Fair aims, honestly stated. I can endorse them in good conscience." As the discussion continued, refining the details of the covenant, Morningstar excused herself briefly to check on the expected arrival of the tribal elders. She returned with news that they had been sighted approaching Spirit Mesa and would reach the farm within 2 hours. "Then we should prepare for the ceremony," Lone Wolf declared, rising to his feet. "It must begin at midday when the sun stands directly overhead, connecting earth and sky." Judge Hollister looked slightly bemused by these mystical considerations, but raised no objection. "I'll use the time to draft the legal document," he offered. "Colonel Richards can review it to ensure the military's interests are represented fairly." As their visitors dispersed to their assigned tasks, Mason found himself alone with Morningstar for a moment. She seemed preoccupied, her expression distant. "What's troubling you?" he asked gently. She hesitated before answering. "The marshal from the territorial capital will arrive tomorrow. What if he overrules everything we accomplished today?" It was a valid concern. A federal marshal would have authority to suspend local arrangements pending investigation, potentially delaying the covenant's implementation indefinitely. "That's why today matters so much," Mason replied. "Once the covenant is signed by a territorial judge and witnessed by a military commander, with the blessing of 7 Apache tribes, it would take a bold marshal indeed to simply dismiss it." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And if necessary, we have Samuel's evidence about Harmon's crimes. The marshal might be reluctant to probe too deeply if it means uncovering corruption in the territorial government." Morningstar nodded, though concern still shadowed her eyes. "I hope you're right. So much depends on this." "We've come through worse in the past few days," Mason reminded her with a smile. "We'll face tomorrow when it comes. For now, let's focus on making today count." By midday, the farm had transformed. Apache warriors in ceremonial attire stood at attention along the path leading from the road to the great oak tree where Samuel was buried. Beneath the oak, a circle of stones had been laid surrounding a central fire pit where sacred herbs smoldered, sending fragrant smoke spiraling toward the cloudless blue sky. Mason, dressed in his best clothes, a dark suit he had brought for Samuel's funeral, but never had the chance to use, stood to one side of the circle. Beside him were Colonel Richards in full-dress uniform, Judge Hollister in his judicial robes, and Deputy Wright wearing a clean shirt and his badge polished to a shine. Across from them, 7 elderly Apache men and women had taken their places, the representatives of the 7 tribes, each wearing traditional regalia and carrying symbols of their office. In the center stood Lone Wolf, resplendent in a ceremonial headdress and beaded buckskins that spoke of his high status. Morningstar occupied the space between these two groups, dressed in a unique combination of styles, a traditional Apache dress adorned with beadwork and silver, but with her hair arranged in a manner Catherine might have recognized. She was in her very appearance the embodiment of the covenant they were about to establish, a bridge between worlds. At precisely noon, when the sun stood directly overhead, Lone Wolf raised his hands toward the sky and began to speak in his native tongue. The melodic phrases rose and fell, like the contours of the land itself, ancient words that had been spoken in this valley for countless generations. When he finished, Morningstar stepped forward to translate, though Mason suspected the tribal elders had understood more English than they let on, a common tactical advantage maintained by the Apache in their dealings with white authorities. "Chief Lone Wolf has invoked the blessing of the Creator and the ancestors," she explained. "He has recounted the history of this land from the time before memory to the present day. He has named the 7 knowledge keepers who died protecting its secrets and honored Samuel Reed, who gave his life in the same cause." Lone Wolf spoke again, more briefly this time, and Morningstar continued her translation. "The chief now calls upon the representatives of the 7 tribes to declare their support for the covenant, to bind their people to its terms for as long as the sun rises and sets over these mesas." One by one, the tribal elders stepped forward, each speaking in their own dialect, each placing a symbolic token in the center of the stone circle: an eagle feather, a piece of turquoise, a small clay pot filled with sacred corn, and other items of significance to their respective tribes. When all 7 had spoken, Morningstar addressed the gathering in English. "The tribes have given their sacred word, bound by symbols of power and permanence. Now we ask the representatives of the United States government to offer their commitment in return." Judge Hollister stepped forward, first a legal document he had drafted held carefully in his hands. "As a duly appointed judge of the Arizona Territory," he intoned formally, "I hereby recognize the historical, cultural, and geological significance of the Reed Farm and the cave system beneath it." He read through the key provisions of the covenant legal protection for the land restrictions on mining activities based on safety concerns, recognition of Apache access rights to sacred areas, and establishment of a trust to maintain the property in perpetuity. "This document," he concluded, "once signed and witnessed, will be filed with the territorial court and copies sent to the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It shall have the full force of law within this territory." Colonel Richards spoke next, his military bearing lending gravity to his words. "As commander of Fort Grant and representative of the United States Army in this district, I endorse this covenant and pledge military support for its enforcement. The Army recognizes the value of peaceful cooperation between settlers and native peoples and sees in this agreement a model for future relations throughout the territory. The formal statements complete. Morningstar invited Mason to speak. He had prepared no remarks, trusting that the right words would come in the moment. Now looking around the circle at the diverse faces of Apache elders, military officer, frontier judge, reformed deputy, and his newly discovered daughter, he felt the weight of the occasion. I stand here today, he began, his voice steady despite his emotion, on land that has witnessed both tragedy and hope. My uncle Samuel Reed saw the potential of this place to heal the divisions between our peoples. He gave his life protecting that vision. Mason glanced at Morningstar, drawing strength from her encouraging smile. This covenant is not just a legal document or a spiritual pledge. It is a promise to future generations that we can find a better way forward together, that the blood that has soaked this ground will be the last shed in conflict between our peoples. He looked directly at the tribal elders. I cannot undo the suffering your people have endured, but I can commit to honoring your traditions, protecting your sacred places, and ensuring that the knowledge preserved by the 7 who died here will not be lost. Turning to Judge Hollister and Colonel Richards, he continued, and I ask my own government to recognize that true progress comes not from conquering the land or its original inhabitants, but from learning to live alongside them in mutual respect. As Mason finished speaking, a profound silence fell over the gathering. Then from somewhere in the distance, an eagle called a clear, piercing cry that echoed across the valley. The tribal elders nodded and murmured among themselves, clearly taking this as a significant omen. Morningstar stepped into the center of the circle, her face solemn but radiant. The eagle speaks for the ancestors, she declared. They accept our covenant. With ceremonial dignity, Judge Hollister placed the legal document on a small table that had been set up beside the circle. One by one, the participants approached to sign or make their mark. Mason first, then Lone Wolf, followed by the judge, the colonel, and each of the tribal elders. Morningstar signed last, using both names, Lucy Morningstar Reed. As she completed her signature, the sun, which had been directly overhead, was momentarily obscured by a single cloud passing across its face. A shadow swept over the gathering, then just as quickly was gone, the sunlight seeming even brighter in its return. Another sign, Lone Wolf remarked quietly to Mason, the shadow of the past giving way to the light of a new day. Whether divine approval or mere coincidence, the timing was undeniably powerful. Mason felt a sense of rightness, of completion, that he had not experienced since before the war. Samuel's final responsibility had been fulfilled. The covenant was established. As the formal ceremony concluded, the gathering transitioned into a more celebratory atmosphere. Food was shared, traditional Apache dishes alongside frontier staples. Music rose from both cultures, a tribal elder playing a wooden flute, while Deputy Wright surprisingly produced a harmonica and joined in with complementary melodies. Mason found himself standing slightly apart, watching the unexpected harmony with a sense of wonder. Morningstar approached, handing him a cup of coffee. Samuel would have loved this, she said softly. Yes, Mason agreed. I think this is exactly what he was working toward all those years. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Then Morningstar spoke again, her voice more hesitant. I've been thinking about what happens next, about my place in all this. Mason turned to face her fully. What do you want to happen next? She considered the question carefully. I want to continue Samuel's work, preserving the knowledge of the 7 tribes, maintaining this place as a bridge between worlds. She met his gaze directly. But I also want to know more about where I came from, about my mother, about the life I might have had. We can do both, Mason assured her. The farm needs to be worked, the covenant maintained. But there's no reason we couldn't travel east someday, visit Pennsylvania, see the place where you were born. He smiled gently. Catherine's brother, your Uncle James, still lives there. He'd be overjoyed to know you're alive. Morningstar's eyes brightened at this notion of extended family. I'd like that, not immediately, but someday. Before Mason could respond, Deputy Wright approached with news. Rider coming fast from town. He reported, his expression concerned. Looks like a telegraph messenger. The 3 of them moved to the front of the property where they could see the road. Indeed, a young man on a lathered horse was approaching at speed, the distinctive cap of the telegraph office visible even at a distance. The messenger reined in sharply, looking flushed and excited. "Deputy Wright," he called. "Urgent telegram from Tucson." Wright accepted the folded paper and scanned it quickly, his expression shifting from concern to surprise. "Well," he said, looking up at Mason and Morningstar, "it seems our federal marshal won't be arriving tomorrow after all." "Why not?" Mason asked, tension evident in his voice. "Because Mayor Harmon's mining partners in Tucson have been arrested by federal agents." Wright explained, a note of satisfaction in his tone. "Apparently, they've been running a silver smuggling operation for years, evading territorial taxes and federal duties. The whole operation is being investigated." Mason exchanged a startled glance with Morningstar. That explains Harmon's desperation to acquire this land, he realized. He needed a legitimate source of silver to cover his smuggling activities. "And with Harmon and his partners exposed," Morningstar added, "the Covenant faces one less threat." Wright nodded, folding the telegram and tucking it into his pocket. "The marshal has been reassigned to the smuggling investigation. We've been granted a reprieve, at least for now." It was unexpected good fortune coming on the heels of the Covenant ceremony. Mason found himself smiling at the irony. Samuel used to say that justice finds its own path in its own time. He was right, Morningstar agreed, as he was about so many things. They returned to the celebration with the welcome news, which was received with approval, but not surprise by Lone Wolf. "The ancestors are at work," he declared simply. "The Covenant has their blessing." As the afternoon waned toward evening, the tribal elders prepared to depart, each approaching Mason and Morningstar to offer personal blessings and words of wisdom. The colonel and judge also took their leave, promising to expedite the official recognition of the Covenant through their respective channels. By sunset, only the core group remained: Mason, Morningstar, Deputy Wright, and Lone Wolf with his honor guard. They gathered on the porch of the cabin, watching as the last golden light painted the mesas in hues of amber and rose. "So," Wright said, breaking a comfortable silence, "what happens now?" "Now we build," Mason replied simply. "The farm needs work. The Covenant needs maintenance. There's much to be done." "Will you stay?" Morningstar asked Wright. "There's a place for you here if you want it." The deputy looked surprised by the offer. "I'm not much of a farmer." "But you're a good man," she said with quiet conviction. "Despite your past mistakes, Samuel saw that in you, so do we." Wright seemed genuinely moved by this vote of confidence. "I might take you up on that," he said gruffly. "Town's not the same without Harmon to keep an eye on. Might be time for a change." Lone Wolf, who had been listening silently, now spoke. "The Covenant must be tended like a garden. It will need guardians from both worlds." He looked at Mason and Morningstar with approval. "I believe Samuel chose well when he brought you two together again." As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the velvet sky, Mason felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges to the Covenant, questions about his right to raise an Apache-raised daughter, skepticism about the farm's unusual purpose. But for the first time in 13 years, he was looking forward rather than backward. The crushing weight of grief that had driven him to drink and wandering had lifted, replaced by purpose and unexpectedly joy. Beside him, Morningstar Lucy gazed up at the stars with the same wonder he remembered from her childhood. Some essential part of her had survived all the transformations, all the losses, and new beginnings. "Do you still remember the constellations?" she asked, suddenly turning to him. "You used to teach them to me, at least I think you did." Mason smiled, deeply touched by this fragment of shared memory. "I do," he confirmed. "That's Orion rising there, the hunter, and above him the Pleiades, the seven sisters." "Seven," she repeated thoughtfully. "Like the seven tribes, like the seven knowledge keepers." "Yes," Mason agreed. "Some patterns repeat themselves across different worlds." As they continued to name the stars together, Mason offering their English names, Morningstar responding with their Apache equivalents, he felt the circle of their lives closing, the lost years, not erased but somehow bridged by this moment of connection. On this land that had seen so much death and sorrow, new life was taking root. A covenant had been sealed not just on paper or in ceremony, but in the renewed bond between father and daughter, in the unlikely friendship between white settlers and Apache elders, in the promise of a different kind of future for this small corner of the frontier. Samuel would have approved, Mason thought. This was what his uncle had been working toward all along, not just preservation of the past, but creation of a new way forward, honoring both worlds while building something that transcended their divisions. As the night deepened around them, the ancient stars bearing witness overhead, Mason Reed finally found himself exactly where he needed to be home. The end.